लक्ष्य ले लिए, मंजिल अपनी प्रत्यक्ष लिए। हम तोड़ रहे हैं जंजीरें, हम बदल रहे हैं तस्वीरें। ये नवयुग है, ये नव भारत है, खुद लिखेंगी अपने तकदीर। हम बदल रहे हैं तस्वीर। हम निकल पड़े हैं पन करके, अपना तन मन अर्पण करके। जीत है एक सूर्य उगाना है, अंबर से उषा जाना है। एक भारत नया बनाना है, एक भारत नया बनाना है। प्रधानमंत्री मोदी डांगरियार এই আত্মনির্ভরশীল ভাৰতৰ সংকল্পেৰে আমাৰ অসমত এখন শক্তিশালী ৰাজ্য আৰু ভাৰতবৰ্ষক বিশ্বগুৰু আসন বহাগ বিহুৰ দিনা মা কামাখ্যা আৰু মহাপুৰুষ শ্ৰীমন্ত শংকৰদেৱৰ ওচৰত তাকেই প্ৰাৰ্থনা জনাই আৰু কৃতজ্ঞ অসমবাসী ৰাইজৰ হৈ প্ৰধানমন্ত্ৰী নৰেন্দ্ৰ মোদী ডাঙৰীয়াক পুনৰ এবাৰ কৃতজ্ঞতা ধন্যবাদ জনাই মই মোৰ বক্তব্যৰ সামৰণি মাৰিছো। ধন্যবাদ। জয় মা ভাৰতী, জয় আই অসম।
आपके कुशल नेतृत्व में असम उन्नति की ओर तीव्र गतिमान हुआ है। धन्यवाद महोदय। देवी और सज्जनों, हमारे क्षेत्र की चिकित्सा सुविधाओं को और मजबूत बनाने के लिए आज 3 मेडिकल कॉलेजेस अर्थात कोकराझार मेडिकल कॉलेज, नौलवाड़ी मेडिकल कॉलेज और नौगांव मेडिकल कॉलेज को अपने कर कमलों द्वारा राष्ट्र को समर्पित करने के लिए मैं माननीय प्रधानमंत्री महोदय से विनम्र निवेदन करती हूँ। आपका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद महोदय। इन तीनों मेडिकल कॉलेजेस के ऊपर आधारित एक लघु चित्र अब आपके समक्ष प्रस्तुत है।
अहोम पूर्वोत्तर का प्रमुख द्वार और 7 बहनों का प्राण केंद्र। हर जिले में एक मेडिकल कॉलेज अस्पताल, ये सपना है देश के स्वप्न दृष्टा नेता प्रगतिशील नायक माननीय प्रधानमंत्री श्री नरेंद्र मोदी जी का।
आज का भारत अयोध्या में प्रभु श्री राम का मंदिर ही नहीं बना रहा, बल्कि देश के हर जिले में मेडिकल कॉलेज भी बना रहा।
इस संकल्प को दृढ़ता के साथ साकार करने की ओर कदम बढ़ाते हुए कल्याणकारी असम सरकार ने कई मेडिकल कॉलेजेस की स्थापना की है। 3 नए मेडिकल कॉलेजों को लेकर राज्य में मेडिकल कॉलेजों की कुल संख्या 12 हो गई है। भविष्य में माननीय प्रधानमंत्री श्री नरेंद्र मोदी जी के सपने को साकार करते हुए राज्य सरकार प्रत्येक जिले में एक मेडिकल कॉलेज की स्थापना के लिए संकल्पबद्ध है। विकास के इस अभियान में नए संयोजन है नौलबाड़ी, नौगांव और कोकराझार मेडिकल कॉलेज अस्पताल। पूर्वोत्तर के विकास के लिए सदा प्रयासरत माननीय प्रधानमंत्री श्री नरेंद्र मोदी जी के सबल नेतृत्व में केंद्र सरकार के आर्थिक सहयोग से तीनों मेडिकल कॉलेज अस्पताल से हजारों जरूरतमंद रोगी लाभान्वित होंगे। इन मेडिकल कॉलेजेस में ओपीडी, आईपीडी सेवा के अलावा 24 घंटे आपातकालीन सेवा उपलब्ध होंगी। मॉड्यूलर टीचिंग, लेबोरेटरी मॉड्यूल, ऑपरेशन थिएटर, उच्च स्तरीय आईसीयू इन मेडिकल कॉलेजेस का हिस्सा है। हर एक मेडिकल कॉलेज में तकरीबन 100 शिक्षकों को नियुक्त किया गया है। लगभग 616 करोड़ की लागत से 82 एकड़ जमीन में नौलबाड़ी मेडिकल कॉलेज अस्पताल बना है। इस मेडिकल कॉलेज से नौलबाड़ी के अलावा तामुलपुर, बक्सा, मंगोलडोई और भूटान सीमावर्ती इलाकों के जरूरतमंद रोगी लाभान्वित होंगे। इस तरह कोकराझार मेडिकल कॉलेज अस्पताल भी रोगियों की सेवा के लिए पूरी तरह से तैयार है। कुल 537 करोड़ की लागत से स्थापित यह मेडिकल कॉलेज अस्पताल सिरंग, ग्वालपारा और भूटान सीमावर्ती के पिछड़े इलाकों की जनता के लिए भी एक आशा का प्रतीक है। मध्य असम के नौगांव मेडिकल कॉलेज अस्पताल राज्य की जनता के लिए अन्य एक आशीर्वाद है। कुल 70 एकड़ जमीन में इस आधुनिक मेडिकल कॉलेज का निर्माण हुआ है। नौगांव के अलावा मोरीगांव, होजाय, गोलाघाट और कार्बी आंगलों की जनता भी लाभान्वित होंगी। हमारे लिए यह अत्यंत सौभाग्य का अवसर है कि देश के माननीय प्रधानमंत्री श्री नरेंद्र मोदी जी के कर कमलों से तीनों मेडिकल कॉलेजेस को जनता की सेवा के लिए समर्पित किया जा रहा है। स्वस्थ भारत का सपना साकार करने की दिशा में ये है केंद्रीय और राज्य सरकार का एक महत्वपूर्ण कदम।
देवी सज्जनों, असम एडवांस्ड हेल्थ केयर इनोवेशन इंस्टीट्यूट अर्थात आही चिकित्सा और स्वास्थ्य सेवा में महत्वपूर्ण आविष्कारों और अनुसंधान एवं विकास की सुविधाएं प्रदान करेगा। अब मैं माननीय प्रधानमंत्री महोदय से आही की औपचारिक आधारशिला रखने के लिए विनम्र अनुरोध करती हूँ। आपका बहुत बहुत आभार महोदय। आहे के ऊपर आधारित एक ऑडियो विजुअल प्रस्तुति अब आपके समक्ष प्रस्तुत है।
माननीय प्रधानमंत्री श्री नरेंद्र मोदी जी के दूरदर्शी नेतृत्व में भारत ने विज्ञान और प्रौद्योगिकी के विकास में उल्लेखनीय प्रगति की है। आत्मनिर्भर भारत और मेक इन इंडिया के साथ भारत इस क्षेत्र में वैश्विक मार्गदर्शक की भूमिका निभा रहा है।
इस अमृत काल में भारत को रिसर्च और इनोवेशन का ग्लोबल सेंटर बनाने के लिए हम सबने एक साथ मिलकर के अनेक मोर्चों पर काम करना है।
माननीय प्रधानमंत्री जी की प्रेरणा से असम आज बहुआयामी विकास के मार्ग पर है। असम सरकार द्वारा 546 करोड़ रुपए के नए निवेश के साथ असम एडवांस्ड हेल्थ केयर इनोवेशन इंस्टीट्यूट आही को IIT गुवाहाटी द्वारा प्रदान की गई 12 एकड़ भूमि पर बनाया जा रहा है। आही संस्कृत में जिसका अर्थ आत्मा है, उत्कृष्टता के एक केंद्र के रूप में स्वास्थ्य विज्ञान में ज्ञान की सीमाओं को आगे बढ़ाने के साथ साथ अत्याधुनिक तकनीकों को विकसित करेगा। आही में 500 बेड का एक सुपर स्पेशलिटी अस्पताल, एक R&D ब्लॉक प्रदान करने वाला एक PG मेडिकल कॉलेज स्थापित किया जाएगा। ये संस्थान रोबोटिक सर्जरी, प्रत्यारोपण सर्जरी, नवजात देखभाल और स्टेम सेल थेरेपी आदि से संबंधित चिकित्सा सेवाएं प्रदान करेगा। आही विश्व और राष्ट्रीय स्तर पर जुड़ा एक ऐसा अस्पताल होगा जो सिमुलेशन प्रयोगशालाओं और ऑगमेंटेड रियलिटी और वर्चुअल रियलिटी वातावरण में मानव संसाधनों को विकसित करेगा। आही में स्वास्थ्य विज्ञान और तकनीकी विकास के लिए विश्व के अग्रणी चिकित्सा और अभियांत्रिकी संकाय एक साथ काम करेंगे, जो भारत के पूर्वोत्तर क्षेत्र में परिवर्तनकारी विकास को प्रेरित करते हुए भारत को एक उन्नत राष्ट्र के रूप में आगे बढ़ाएगा।
आज का दिन असम और संपूर्ण पूर्वोत्तर के लिए स्वास्थ्य सेवा क्षेत्र में एक अत्यंत महत्वपूर्ण दिन है। हमारे राज्य में सार्वजनिक स्वास्थ्य प्रणालियों की गुणवत्ता और पहुंच को बढ़ाने के उद्देश्य से भारत के माननीय प्रधानमंत्री जी ने मई 2017 में एम्स की आधारशिला रखी थी। और हमें पुनः ये बताते हुए अपार हर्ष हो रहा है कि आज कुछ ही समय पूर्व माननीय प्रधानमंत्री जी के कर कमलों द्वारा एम्स राष्ट्र को समर्पित किया गया है। हम पुनः माननीय प्रधानमंत्री जी का हार्दिक आभार व्यक्त करते हैं। एम्स के ऊपर आधारित एक ऑडियो विजुअल प्रस्तुति अब आपके सामने प्रस्तुत है।
देश में उच्चतम स्वास्थ्य सेवाओं को हर नागरिक तक पहुंचाने के लिए भारत सरकार प्रतिबद्ध है। देश के यशस्वी प्रधानमंत्री श्री नरेंद्र मोदी जी के नेतृत्व में पिछले 9 वर्षों में स्वास्थ्य क्षेत्र में अभूतपूर्व कार्य हुए हैं और इसी का परिणाम है कि देश स्वास्थ्य एवं चिकित्सा के क्षेत्र में आत्मनिर्भर हो रहा है। आयुष्मान भारत पीएम जैसे गरीबों को मिला 5 लाख रुपए तक मुफ्त इलाज, हजारों जन औषधि केंद्रों पर 90% तक सस्ती दवाइयां मिल रही हैं। 1.5 लाख हेल्थ एंड वेलनेस सेंटर और पीएम अभीम से मेडिकल इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर सशक्त हो रहा है। आयुष्मान भारत डिजिटल स्वास्थ्य मिशन से स्वास्थ्य सेवाओं का लाभ लेना आसान हुआ है। 2014 में देश में 8 एम्स थे और अब एम्स की संख्या 23 हो गई है। साथ ही मेडिकल कॉलेजों और मेडिकल सीटों में रिकॉर्ड वृद्धि से देश में उच्च स्तरीय चिकित्सा सेवाओं का मजबूत नेटवर्क तैयार हो रहा है।
बीते 9 वर्षों में भारत में भी स्वास्थ्य सेवाओं को लेकर बहुत ईमानदारी से, बहुत कुशलता से कार्य करने का प्रयास किया गया है।
इसी कड़ी में आज प्रधानमंत्री श्री नरेंद्र मोदी जी के कर कमलों द्वारा एम्स गुवाहाटी का लोकार्पण किया जा रहा है, जो कि इस क्षेत्र में अति आधुनिक चिकित्सा सेवाएं उपलब्ध कराने की दिशा में महत्वपूर्ण कदम है। 1100 करोड़ रुपए से अधिक की लागत से बनकर तैयार हुए एम्स गुवाहाटी का शिलान्यास 26 मई 2017 को माननीय प्रधानमंत्री श्री नरेंद्र मोदी जी के द्वारा ही हुआ था। 750 बेड्स के इस अस्पताल में कार्डियोलॉजी, न्यूरोलॉजी, ऑन्कोलॉजी समेत 28 स्पेशलिटी और सुपर स्पेशलिटी सेवाएं उपलब्ध हैं, जिनसे तमाम गंभीर बीमारियों का इलाज अब आसानी से कराया जा सकता है। अस्पताल में इलाज से संबंधित हाईटेक मशीनें, जांच सेवाएं और कुशल स्पेशलिस्ट डॉक्टर और पैरामेडिकल स्टाफ की टीम उपलब्ध है। इसके साथ ही चिकित्सा शिक्षा के लिए MBBS की 100 सीटें और नर्सिंग शिक्षा की 60 सीटें हैं। एम्स गुवाहाटी में आयुष सेवाएं भी उपलब्ध होंगी। मरीजों के लिए टेलीमेडिसिन की सुविधा भी उपलब्ध कराई गई है। साथ ही चिकित्सा क्षेत्र में शोध को बढ़ावा देने की पूरी व्यवस्था है। एम्स गुवाहाटी के बन जाने से देश के पूर्वोत्तर राज्यों के लोगों को उच्च स्तरीय स्वास्थ्य सेवाओं का लाभ अपने घर के नजदीक आसानी से मिल सकेगा। असम के साथ साथ नागालैंड, सिक्किम, त्रिपुरा, अरुणाचल प्रदेश, मेघालय, मिजोरम और मणिपुर के लोग बड़ी संख्या में लाभान्वित होंगे। इसके साथ ही एम्स गुवाहाटी के बनने से इस क्षेत्र में रोजगार के नए विकल्प खुल गए हैं। स्वस्थ भारत के संकल्प की दिशा में अहम कदम है एम्स गुवाहाटी, जिसके माध्यम से अब अंतिम पंक्ति में खड़े व्यक्ति तक स्वास्थ्य सेवाएं पहुंचाना संभव हो रहा है। पूर्वोत्तर राज्यों के लोगों के लिए अति आधुनिक चिकित्सा सेवाएं उपलब्ध कराकर होलिस्टिक हेल्थ केयर सुनिश्चित करेगा एम्स गुवाहाटी।
देवी और सज्जनों, प्रधानमंत्री जन आरोग्य योजना के माध्यम से असम के लोगों को 1 करोड़ 10 लाख आयुष्मान भारत प्रधानमंत्री जन आरोग्य योजना कार्ड के वितरण के लिए महत्वपूर्ण अभियान शुरू करने हेतु एक अनूठी पहल की गई है। प्रस्तुत है इसी के ऊपर निर्मित एक लघु चित्र।
माननीय प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी जी के मार्गदर्शन में पिछले 1 दशक में भारत के स्वास्थ्य क्षेत्र में अभूतपूर्व परिवर्तन हुए हैं। समग्र देश के साथ उत्तर पूर्वांचल को भी इसका लाभ मिला है। माननीय प्रधानमंत्री जी की एक स्वप्निल योजना आयुष्मान भारत प्रधानमंत्री जन आरोग्य योजना, इस योजना के अंतर्गत देश के गरीब और निम्न आय वर्ग के लोगों को सूचीबद्ध सरकारी अस्पतालों और निजी अस्पतालों में 5 लाख रुपयों तक की निःशुल्क चिकित्सा सेवाएं प्रदान की जाती हैं। अब तक समग्र देश में 4,57,00,000 लोगों ने इस योजना के माध्यम से चिकित्सा सेवाएं प्राप्त की हैं।
देश के 50 करोड़ से ज्यादा भाई बहनों को 5 लाख रुपए तक का हेल्थ एश्योरेंस देने वाली ये दुनिया की अपनी तरह की सबसे बड़ी योजना है।
पात्र लाभार्थियों को इस योजना का लाभ आसानी से उपलब्ध कराने के लिए आपके द्वार आयुष्मान शुरू किया गया। आपके द्वार आयुष्मान के माध्यम से सभी पात्र लाभार्थियों को प्रधानमंत्री जन आरोग्य योजना के लाभों के बारे में सूचित करने के प्रयास किए गए हैं। लोगों को घर बैठे योजना के लिए नामांकन करने की सुविधा प्रदान करने के प्रयास किए गए हैं।
मैं आशा बाइदेव बा ওচৰৰ অংগনবাদী বাইদেউ যিবোৰ মানুহে অলৰেডি এইটো সুবিধা পোৱা নাই আয়ুষ্মান ভাৰত কাৰ্ড ঘৰে ঘৰে গৈ পেলাই আমি বনাই দি আছো।
এই গাঁওখনৰ গৰীব মানুহখিনি MPW ছাৰৰ লগত प्रत्येक पाबलगिया प्रत्येक आयुष्मान भारत कार्ड बनाई दिया सो।
असम में इस योजना को हर घर तक ले जाने के लिए एक जन आंदोलन की तरह आपके द्वार आयुष्मान कार्यक्रम का शुभारंभ किया गया। आशा कार्यकर्ता, बीमा कार्यकर्ता, कृषि कार्यकर्ता सहित 25,000 से अधिक कार्यकर्ता ने इस जन आंदोलन को सफल बनाने के लिए भाग लिया। इन लोगों की मदद से प्रतिदिन 2,50,000 से अधिक लाभार्थियों का इलेक्ट्रॉनिक सत्यापन पूरा किया जा रहा है। प्रधानमंत्री जन आरोग्य योजना के माध्यम से अब तक लाखों लोगों को निःशुल्क स्वास्थ्य सेवाएं प्रदान की जा चुकी हैं।
मोर लड़ा नियोलॉजी पेशेंट এতিয়া MPW ছাৰ আৰু আশা বাইদেউ আহি ঘৰতে আমাক আয়ুষ্মান ভাৰত কাৰ্ডখন বনাই দিলে। ইয়াত আমি 5 লাখ টকা সুবিধা পাম। এতিয়া মই বেমাৰটো দেখাবলৈ অলপ আগবাঢ়ি যাম বুলি ভাবিছো।
बहाग बिहू तथा अम्बेडकर जयंती के इस पवित्र अवसर पर आज माननीय प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी जी 1,10,00,000 लाभार्थियों को आयुष्मान भारत कार्ड प्रदान कार्य का शुभारंभ करेंगे। तो आइए हम सब इस सुनहरे पल के साक्षी बने
कि इस योजना से जुड़े हर व्यक्ति के प्रयासों से हम इस योजना को सफल बना पाएंगे। न्यू इंडिया स्वस्थ हो, न्यू इंडिया सशक्त हो, आप सभी आरोग्य रहे, आयुष्मान रहे।
अब मैं माननीय प्रधानमंत्री महोदय से निवेदन करूंगी कि वे कृपया 3 लाभार्थियों को अपने कर कमलों द्वारा आयुष्मान भारत प्रधानमंत्री जन आरोग्य योजना कार्ड प्रदान करें और औपचारिक रूप से इस वितरण अभियान का शुभारंभ करने की कृपया करें। श्रीमती मीनाक्षी बॉर्डोलोई, मोरीगांव। श्रीमती निराला देवी, कामरूप। श्री पदन दास, दरंग। धन्यवाद महोदय। आज का दिन असम के स्वास्थ्य के मानचित्र में एक सुनहरा और महत्वपूर्ण दिन साबित होगा। अब मैं विनम्र निवेदन करती हूं भारत के माननीय प्रधानमंत्री श्री नरेंद्र मोदी जी से कि वे कृपया आज के इस भव्य सभा को संबोधित करें।
असम के गवर्नर श्रीमान गुलाबचंद कटारिया जी, मुख्यमंत्री श्रीमान हेमंता बिश्वा शर्मा जी, केंद्रीय मंत्रिमंडल के मेरे सहयोगी, देश के आरोग्य मंत्री मनसुख मांडविया जी, डॉक्टर भारती पवार जी, असम सरकार के मंत्री केशव महंता जी, यहां उपस्थित मेडिकल जगत के सभी महानुभाव, अन्य महानुभाव, अलग अलग स्थानों पर वीडियो कॉन्फ्रेंस से जुड़े हुए सभी महानुभाव और असम के मेरे प्यारे भाइयों और बहनों, मां कामाख्यार ये पवित्रो भूमिर पौरा ओहमोर होमो भाटनी भोगनोई लोई मोर प्रणाम। आप सभी को रोंगाली बिहू की बहुत बहुत शुभकामनाएं। इस पावन अवसर पर असम के नॉर्थ ईस्ट के हेल्थ इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर को आज एक नई ताकत मिली है। आज नॉर्थ ईस्ट को अपना पहला एम्स मिला है और असम को 3 नए मेडिकल कॉलेज मिले हैं। आईआईटी गुवाहाटी के साथ मिलकर आधुनिक रिसर्च के लिए 500 बेड वाले सुपर स्पेशलिटी अस्पताल का भी शिलान्यास हुआ है और असम के लाखों लाख साथियों तक आयुष्मान कार्ड पहुंचाने का काम मिशन मोड पे शुरू हुआ है। नए एम्स से असम के अलावा अरुणाचल प्रदेश, नागालैंड, मेघालय, मिजोरम और मणिपुर के साथियों को भी इसका बहुत लाभ मिलने वाला है। आरोग्य के इन सारे प्रोजेक्ट्स के लिए आप सभी को, नॉर्थ ईस्ट के सभी मेरे भाइयों बहनों को बहुत बहुत बधाई और बहुत बहुत शुभकामनाएं। भाइयों और बहनों, पिछले 9 वर्षों में नॉर्थ ईस्ट में कनेक्टिविटी से जुड़े इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर को लेकर बहुत चर्चा हुई है। आज जो भी नॉर्थ ईस्ट आता है तो यहां के रोड, रेल, एयरपोर्ट से जुड़े कार्यों को देखकर प्रशंसा किए बिना रह नहीं सकता है। लेकिन नॉर्थ ईस्ट में एक और इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर पर बहुत तेजी से काम हुआ है और वो है सोशल इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर। यहां शिक्षा और स्वास्थ्य की सुविधाओं का जो विस्तार हुआ है वो वाकई दोस्तों अभूतपूर्व है। पिछले वर्ष जब मैं डिब्रूगढ़ आया था तो असम के अनेक जिलों में मुझे एक साथ कई अस्पतालों का शिलान्यास और उद्घाटन करने का अवसर मिला था। आज एम्स और 3 मेडिकल कॉलेज आपको सौंपने का मुझे सौभाग्य मिला है। बीते वर्षों में असम में डेंटल कॉलेजों की सुविधा का भी विस्तार हुआ है। इन सभी को नॉर्थ ईस्ट में लगातार बेहतर होती रेल रोड कनेक्टिविटी से भी मदद मिल रही है। विशेष रूप से गर्भावस्था के दौरान महिलाओं को जो समस्या आती थी वो अब दूर हुई है। इससे माता और बच्चे के जीवन पर संकट बहुत कम हुआ है। आजकल एक नई बीमारी देखने को मिल रही है। मैं देश में कहीं भी जाता हूं, उत्तर में, दक्षिण में, नॉर्थ ईस्ट में, पिछले 9 वर्षों में हुए विकास की चर्चा करता हूं तो कुछ लोगों को बहुत परेशानी हो जाती है। ये नई बीमारी है। वो शिकायत करते हैं कि दशकों तक उन्होंने भी देश पर राज किया है, उन्हें क्रेडिट क्यों नहीं मिलता। क्रेडिट के भूखे लोगों और जनता पर राज करने की भावना ने देश का बहुत अहित किया है। अरे जनता तो जनार्दन का रूप होती है, ईश्वर का रूप होती है। पहले वाले क्रेडिट के भूखे थे, इसलिए नॉर्थ ईस्ट उन्हें दूर लगता था। एक परायेपन का भाव उन्होंने पैदा कर दिया था। हम तो सेवा भाव से, आपके सेवक होने की भावना से, समर्पण भाव से आपकी सेवा करते रहते हैं। इसलिए नॉर्थ ईस्ट हमें दूर भी नहीं लगता और अपनेपन का भाव भी कभी भी कम नहीं होता है। मुझे खुशी है कि आज नॉर्थ ईस्ट में लोगों ने विकास की बागडोर आगे बढ़कर खुद संभाल ली है। वो नॉर्थ ईस्ट के विकास से भारत के विकास के मंत्र को लेकर आगे बढ़ रहे हैं। विकास के इस नए आंदोलन में केंद्र सरकार एक दोस्त बनकर, एक सेवक बनकर, एक साथी बनकर सभी राज्यों के साथ काम कर रही है। आज का ये आयोजन भी इसी का एक जीता जागता उदाहरण है। साथियों, दशकों तक हमारा पूर्वोत्तर कई और चुनौतियों से जूझता रहा है। जब किसी सेक्टर में परिवारवाद, क्षेत्रवाद, भ्रष्टाचार और अस्थिरता की राजनीति हावी होती है, तब विकास होना असंभव हो जाता है। और यही हमारे हेल्थ केयर सिस्टम के साथ हुआ। दिल्ली में जो एम्स है वो 50 के दशक में बना था। देश के कोने कोने से लोग आकर दिल्ली एम्स में इलाज कराते थे, लेकिन दशकों तक किसी ने ये नहीं सोचा कि देश के दूसरे हिस्सों में भी एम्स खोलने चाहिए। अटल जी की जब सरकार थी तो उन्होंने पहली बार इसके लिए प्रयास शुरू किए थे, लेकिन उनकी सरकार जाने के बाद फिर सबका ठप पड़ गया। जो एम्स खोले भी गए वहां व्यवस्थाएं खस्ता हाल ही रही। 2014 के बाद हमने इन सारी कमियों को दूर किया। हमने बीते वर्षों में 15 नए एम्स पर काम शुरू किया। 15। इनमें से अधिकतर में इलाज और पढ़ाई दोनों सुविधा शुरू हो चुकी है। एम्स गुवाहाटी भी इस बात का उदाहरण है कि हमारी सरकार जो संकल्प लेती है उसे सिद्ध करके भी दिखाती है। ये असम की जनता का प्यार है जो मुझे बार बार यहां खींच के ले आता है। शिलान्यास के समय भी आपके प्यार ने मुझे यहां बुला लिया और आज लोकार्पण के समय भी आपका प्यार बढ़ चढ़ करके, और वो भी बिहू के पवित्र समय, यहां मुझे आने का अवसर मिल गया। ये आपका प्यार ही है। साथियों, पहले की सरकारों की नीतियों की वजह से हमारे यहां डॉक्टरों और दूसरे मेडिकल प्रोफेशनल की बहुत कमी रही है। ये कमी भारत में क्वालिटी हेल्थ सर्विस के सामने बहुत बड़ी दीवार थी। इसलिए बीते 9 वर्षों में हमारी सरकार ने मेडिकल इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर और मेडिकल प्रोफेशनल बढ़ाने पर बड़े स्तर पर काम किया है। दो 2014 से पहले 10 सालों में करीब 150 मेडिकल कॉलेज बने थे। पिछले 9 वर्षों में हमारी सरकार में करीब 300 नए मेडिकल कॉलेज बने। पिछले 9 वर्षों में देश में एमबीबीएस सीटें भी 2 गुनी बढ़कर 1 लाख से अधिक हो चुकी है। पिछले 9 वर्षों में देश में मेडिकल की पीजी सीटों में भी 110% की बढ़ोतरी हुई है। हमने मेडिकल शिक्षा के विस्तार के लिए नेशनल मेडिकल कमीशन की स्थापना की है। पिछड़े परिवारों को, बैकवर्ड फैमिलीज के बच्चे डॉक्टर बन सके, इसके लिए हमने आरक्षण की सुविधा का भी विस्तार किया है। दूर दराज वाले क्षेत्रों के बच्चे भी डॉक्टर बन सके, इसलिए हमने पहली बार भारतीय भाषाओं में मेडिकल की पढ़ाई का विकल्प दिया है। इस वर्ष के बजट में 150 से अधिक नर्सिंग कॉलेज खोलने का ऐलान भी किया गया है। अगर मैं नॉर्थ ईस्ट की बात करूं, यहां भी बीते 9 वर्षों में मेडिकल कॉलेज की संख्या 2 गुने से अधिक हो चुकी है। अभी अनेक मेडिकल कॉलेजों पर काम चल रहा है। कई नए मेडिकल कॉलेज यहां बनने जा रहे हैं। बीते 9 वर्षों में नॉर्थ ईस्ट में मेडिकल की सीटों की संख्या भी बढ़कर पहले के मुकाबले 2 गुनी हो चुकी है। भाइयों और बहनों, आज भारत में हेल्थ सेक्टर में इतना काम इसलिए हो रहा है क्योंकि आप सभी देशवासियों ने 2014 में एक स्थिर और मजबूत सरकार बनाई। भाजपा की सरकारों में नीति, नियत और निष्ठा किसी स्वार्थ से नहीं, बल्कि राष्ट्र प्रथम, देशवासी प्रथम, इसी भावना से हमारी नीतियां तय होती है। इसलिए हमने वोट बैंक के बजाय देश की जनता की मुश्किलों को कम करने पर फोकस किया। हमने लक्ष्य बनाया कि हमारी बहनों को इलाज के लिए दूर ना जाना पड़े, हमने तय किया कि किसी गरीब को पैसे के अभाव में अपना इलाज न टालना पड़े। हमने प्रयास किया कि हमारे गरीब परिवारों को भी घर के पास ही बेहतर इलाज मिले। साथियों, मैं जानता हूं कि इलाज के लिए पैसे ना होना गरीब की कितनी बड़ी चिंता होती है। इसलिए हमारी सरकार ने 5 लाख रुपए तक का मुफ्त इलाज देने वाली आयुष्मान योजना शुरू की। मैं जानता हूं कि महंगी दवाइयों से गरीब और मध्यम वर्ग कितना परेशान होता है। इसलिए हमारी सरकार ने 9,000 से ज्यादा जन औषधि केंद्र खोले। इन केंद्रों पर सैकड़ों दवाइयां सस्ते में उपलब्ध कराई। मैं जानता हूं हार्ट के ऑपरेशन में, घुटने के ऑपरेशन में गरीब और मध्यम वर्ग का कितना ज्यादा खर्च हो रहा था। इसलिए हमारी सरकार ने स्टेंट की कीमतों को नियंत्रित किया, नी इम्प्लांट की कीमतों को नियंत्रित किया। मैं जानता हूं कि जब गरीब को डायलिसिस की जरूरत होती है तो वो कितना परेशान होता है। इसलिए हमारी सरकार ने हर जिले में मुफ्त डायलिसिस वाली योजना शुरू की। लाखों लोगों को इसका फायदा पहुंचाया। मैं जानता हूं गंभीर बीमारी का समय से पता लगना कितना जरूरी होता है। इसलिए हमारी सरकार ने देश भर में 1.5 लाख से ज्यादा हेल्थ और वेलनेस सेंटर खोले हैं। वहां जरूरी टेस्ट की सुविधा दी है। मैं जानता हूं कि टीबी की बीमारी कितने दशकों से गरीबों के लिए बहुत बड़ी चुनौती बनी हुई है। इसलिए हमारी सरकार ने प्रधानमंत्री टीबी मुक्त भारत योजना अभियान शुरू किया। हमने बाकी दुनिया से 5 वर्ष पहले ही भारत को टीबी से मुक्त करने का लक्ष्य रखा है। मैं जानता हूं कि बीमारी किस तरह गरीब और मध्यम वर्ग के परिवार को बर्बाद कर देती है। इसलिए हमारी सरकार ने प्रिवेंटिव हेल्थ केयर पर फोकस किया। बीमार हो ही नहीं, बीमारी आए ही नहीं, इस पर फोकस किया। योग, आयुर्वेद, फिट इंडिया अभियान चलाकर हमने लोगों की निरंतर सेहत के प्रति जागरूक किया है। साथियों, आज जब मैं सरकार की इन योजनाओं की सफलता देखता हूं तो खुद को धन्य मानता हूं कि गरीब की इतनी सेवा करने का परमात्मा ने और जनता जनार्दन ने मुझे आशीर्वाद दिया। आयुष्मान भारत, प्रधानमंत्री जन आरोग्य योजना आज देश के करोड़ों गरीबों का बहुत बड़ा संबल बनी है। बीते वर्षों में आयुष्मान भारत योजना ने गरीबों के 80,000 करोड़ रुपए खर्च होने से बचाए हैं। जन औषधि केंद्रों की वजह से गरीब और मध्यम वर्ग के 20,000 करोड़ रुपए खर्च होने से बचे हैं। स्टेंट और नी इम्प्लांट की कीमत कम होने से गरीब और मध्यम वर्ग के हर साल 13,000 करोड़ रुपए बच रहे हैं। मुफ्त डायलिसिस की सुविधा से भी किडनी के गरीब मरीजों के 500 करोड़ रुपए से ज्यादा खर्च होने से बचे हैं। आज यहां असम के करीब 1 करोड़ से भी ज्यादा नागरिकों को आयुष्मान भारत कार्ड देने का अभियान भी शुरू हुआ है। इस अभियान से असम के लोगों को बहुत बड़ी मदद मिलने वाली है, उनके पैसे बचने वाले हैं। साथियों, मैं अक्सर देश के कोने कोने में हमारी सरकार की योजनाओं के लाभार्थियों से मुलाकात करता रहता हूं। इसमें बहुत बड़ी संख्या में हमारी माताएं, बहनें, हमारे देश की बेटियां, हमारी महिलाएं शामिल होती हैं। वो मुझे बताती है कि पहले इसकी सरकारों में और अब भाजपा सरकार के समय में स्वास्थ्य सुविधाओं में कितना बड़ा फर्क आया है। आप और हम ये जानते हैं कि जब स्वास्थ्य की बात होती है, इलाज की बात होती है, तो हमारे यहां महिलाएं अक्सर पीछे रह जाती है। हमारी माताओं बहनों को खुद को लगता है कि क्यों अपने इलाज पर घर का पैसा खर्च करवाएं, क्यों अपनी वजह से दूसरों को इतनी तकलीफ दें। संसाधनों की कमी की वजह से, आर्थिक तंगी की वजह से जिन हालातों में देश की करोड़ों महिलाएं रह रही थी, उसमें उनका स्वास्थ्य ही सबसे ज्यादा प्रभावित था। भाजपा के नेतृत्व वाली हमारी सरकार ने जो योजनाएं शुरू की, उसका बहुत बड़ा लाभ हमारी माताओं बहनों को, महिलाओं की सेहत को हुआ है। स्वच्छ भारत अभियान के तहत बने करोड़ों शौचालय ने महिलाओं को बहुत सारी बीमारियों से बचाया है। उज्ज्वला योजना के तहत मिले गैस, उस गैस कनेक्शन से महिलाओं को जानलेवा धुएं से मुक्ति दिलाई है। जल जीवन मिशन के तहत हर घर जल आने से करोड़ों महिलाओं का पानी से होने वाली बीमारियों से बचाव हुआ है। मिशन इंद्रधनुष ने करोड़ों महिलाओं का मुफ्त टीकाकरण करके उन्हें गंभीर बीमारी से बचाया है। आयुष्मान भारत योजना ने महिलाओं को अस्पताल में 5 लाख रुपए तक के मुफ्त इलाज का भरोसा दिया है। प्रधानमंत्री मातृ वंदना योजना ने महिलाओं को गर्भावस्था के दौरान आर्थिक मदद दी है। राष्ट्रीय पोषण अभियान ने महिलाओं को पौष्टिक भोजन मुहैया कराने में मदद की है। जब सरकार संवेदनशील होती है, जब गरीब के प्रति सेवा की भावना होती है, तो ऐसे ही काम किया जाता है। साथियों, हमारी सरकार भारत के हेल्थ सेक्टर का 21वीं सदी की आवश्यकता के मुताबिक आधुनिकीकरण भी कर रही है। आज आयुष्मान भारत डिजिटल हेल्थ मिशन से देशवासियों को डिजिटल हेल्थ आईडी दी जा रही है। देश भर के अस्पतालों, हेल्थ प्रोफेशनल्स को एक प्लेटफॉर्म पर लाया जा रहा है। इससे एक क्लिक पर ही देश के नागरिक का पूरा हेल्थ रिकॉर्ड उपलब्ध हो जाएगा। इससे अस्पतालों में इलाज की सुविधा बढ़ेगी, सही डॉक्टर तक पहुंचना सरल होगा। मुझे खुशी है कि इस योजना के तहत अभी तक लगभग 38 करोड़ डिजिटल आईडी बनाई जा चुकी है। इसमें 2 लाख से अधिक हेल्थ फैसिलिटी और 1.5 लाख से अधिक हेल्थ प्रोफेशनल वेरीफाई हो चुके हैं। आज ई संजीवनी भी घर बैठे बैठे उपचार का पसंदीदा माध्यम बनती जा रही है। हम सुविधा का लाभ देश भर के 10 करोड़ साथी ले चुके हैं। इससे समय और पैसा दोनों की बचत सुनिश्चित हो रही है। भाइयों और बहनों, भारत के हेल्थ केयर सिस्टम में परिवर्तन का सबसे बड़ा आधार है सबका प्रयास। कोरोना के संकट काल में भी हमने सबका प्रयास की ताकत देखी है। दुनिया के सबसे बड़े, सबसे तेज, सबसे प्रभावी कोविड टीकाकरण अभियान की प्रशंसा आज दुनिया कर रही है। हमने मेड इन इंडिया वैक्सीन बनाई, उन्हें बहुत कम समय के भीतर दूर दूर तक पहुंचाया। इसमें आशा वर्कर, आंगनवाड़ी कार्यकर्ता, प्राइमरी हेल्थ केयर वर्कर से लेकर फार्मास्यूटिकल सेक्टर तक के सारे साथी ने शानदार काम किया है। इतना बड़ा महायज्ञ तभी सफल होता है जब सबका प्रयास हो और सबका विश्वास हो। सबका प्रयास की भावना के साथ हमें आगे बढ़ना है। आइए सबका प्रयास से स्वस्थ भारत, समृद्ध भारत के मिशन को हम पूरी निष्ठा से आगे बढ़ाएं। एक बार फिर एम्स और मेडिकल कॉलेज के लिए असम के लोगों को मैं फिर एक बार बहुत बहुत बधाई देता हूं। और आपने जो प्यार दिखाया, इतनी बड़ी तादाद में आशीर्वाद देने आए, आपको प्रणाम करते हुए, आपका धन्यवाद करते हुए मेरी वाणी को विराम देता हूं।
महोदय, आपकी उपस्थिति और ज्ञानवर्धक शब्दों के लिए आपका बहुत बहुत आभार। देवी और सज्जनों, आप सभी का धन्यवाद करते हुए आज के इस विशेष समारोह का हम समापन करते हैं। धन्यवाद, नमस्कार।
तो आप देख रहे थे सीधा प्रसारण गुवाहाटी से, असम गुवाहाटी से, जहां प्रधानमंत्री
when a member of their community assassinated Gandhiji, what followed was also wrong, and it's never talked about, which is this massive rioting against the Maharashtrian Brahmin community. Savarkar's brother, Narayan, was dragged out of his house and stoned to death. The revolutionaries, remember, are modernists. After independence, the revolutionaries were deliberately pushed out of the national power structure. The single most important event that led to Indian freedom is the naval revolt. It is unnecessarily foisted on the Indian Muslim. Most of them are descendants of Indians, not of Turkic invaders. Mughals did try to make their way back. And Babur is absolutely clear why he came to India. He came for the gold. He says so himself. Dyer was actually given a saropa in the Golden Temple. Now, that is bad in itself. But when you go there, you realize that the Jallianwala Bagh and the Golden Temple are 300 meters apart. Idea of Khalistani movement, interestingly, even today, comes from exactly those same Gurudwaras that had been infiltrated with Hopkinson 100 years ago. The BBC program that was recently done, very controversial one. What is interestingly that much of this is actually done by people of Indian ethnic origin. India is a rising power. And so many of the deep state and corporate and geostrategic interests will want to trip us.
Namaste, Jai Hind. Welcome to another edition of ANI Podcast with Smita Prakash. Today, my guest is noted historian and economist Sanjeev Sanyal. Sanjeev is very active on social media and he's a hot favorite at LitFest, where he talks about Indian history, its biases, which he says are Nehruvian, colonial, and Marxist in nature. His critics say that he plays to majoritarian biases, but there is no doubting his scholarship. He's the recipient of the Eisenhower Fellowship, named Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum, an adjunct fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies at the NUS, Singapore, fellow at the Royal Geographical Society, London, visiting scholar at the Oxford University. And because Sanjeev Sanyal is member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India and helped prepare 6 editions of the Economic Survey of India, there will be a few questions on the state of the Indian economy. But first, about his book, Revolutionaries, the Other Story of How India Won Its Freedom. Sanjeev, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. You've done a whole lot of TV interviews about your book. I had on the podcast J. Sai Deepak and Vikram Sampath, who spoke about how Indian history was one-sided. Now, most of us, the only source of history as such was that what we read in school textbooks. And now all of you are coming out, a whole bunch of you are coming out, authors, telling us that our history narration, which was there in our textbooks, was one-sided, was colored. And you're coming out with these stories, making us rethink that, why weren't we told about all this earlier? Why was our history so colored, so biased?
So first of all, thank you very much, Smita, for having me on your show. Why did I write the book? Well, it's a multiple factors here. Obviously, one part of it, of course, as many people have guessed, many of the characters in the book are directly related to me. So I had some interest in those characters. I knew some of them, incidentally. Many of them lived into the 1980s. But I think the real thrust of why I went into this is somehow the story of India's freedom struggle never quite added up. And yes, you did hear, there was Netaji did this and Bhagat Singh did that kind of thing, the odd anecdote. But you always got the impression that never quite added up to anything. So at some point in time, I began to investigate it myself. I'm a curious sort of chap, and a completely different story began to emerge out of that. As I said, it's coincidental that I am also related to some of these people, and they had told me anecdotes, but I never quite made sense of them till I really read this, began researching this book.
So
you do mention about the Sanyal family. You put photographs also in the book. And like they said, you say that they spoke to you. Many of us, when you're children, like
Yes.
grown-ups telling you that,
Mm.
oh, we did this, oh, we did
Mm.
that, and this is what your uncle was. Don't pursue it further. But something must have motivated you that, no, I've got to, go dig deeper into this because it's so well researched. You've gone to libraries, you've actually gone to those locations, you've been to the jail cells. Some of the things that you write about the torture in the jails and all, it's very moving. It's very disturbing even. And the number of things, like the plots that you talk about. In fact, there are many times where somebody came late.
Mhm.
They were supposed to escape. Gadi late paunchy.
Mm.
And then I wonder, if only we had cell phones in those times, sending location. Okay, this is where I'm going to be, and just have pick me up, and I will escape. And so many things that happened that went wrong. So tell me, when did you decide that okay, these distortions were there? Somewhere there are gaps, as you say. When did you decide, okay, I'm going to pursue this?
So I didn't consciously think about this to start with. Do remember that before I began researching this, I was already writing books. So I'd already written a bunch of books. And at some point in time, just out of curiosity, I was also reading some of these characters. Some of these incidents are mentioned even in Ocean of Churn, for example, not in detail, but I mentioned them along the way. So at some point, I had gathered enough material that a picture began to emerge. For example, I began to get Bandi Jeevan, Sachindranath Sanyal's autobiography, into English. It's not yet been published. It will come out hopefully end of this year. But in the very preface of that, he says, the reason I'm writing this book, because I feel that a few chapters of Indian history will otherwise not be truthfully written. So there is this premonition he already has that the story of the revolutionary is somehow, swept under the carpet or misrepresented, and he felt that he had to write his own testimony. And so when I read that, it felt like, oh my God, he's almost speaking to me, saying that you need to go out there and write our story.
And you've written about both sides of your family.
Yes.
In a part of the freedom struggle. Tell us about that.
So both sides of my mother's and father's family were in the freedom struggle. Both of them related to the revolutionary, the armed struggle part of the freedom struggle. So my father's family, they're Bengali, but they had settled in Varanasi in the late 18th century. There's still a neighborhood there called Bengali Tola. And they were very famous Vedic scholars. And over time, they intermarried with a wider community of Sanyals and Lahiris and others who settled in that area. You may even have heard of Lahiri Mahashai, who gave modern Kriya Yoga its modern form. He is a great grand uncle of mine. So they were living there. And what they did was, interestingly, they ran a Vedic school and an attached akhada. And as I tell you in the book, this network of akhadas across India really became the driving force of the Anushilan Samiti, i.e. the revolutionary movement. So
just a small explainer to guests who live, our listeners who live abroad, what is an akhada and what was the connection with Anushilan?
So akhadas are essentially gymnasiums, you can call them, but they're quasi-religious gymnasiums. So they're not secular places you hang out there and just do weights. They have existed since ancient times in India. These networks were very important to resistance to foreign invasions in the past, whether it's the Turks, the Mughals, the Europeans, and so on. And they had been basically defanged in the course of the 19th century by the British, and sort of taken away from their quasi-religious military role, and increasingly sort of secularized into sort of the gymnasiums or sports clubs. What Sri Aurobindo does is he understands that this is what's happening. This is the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, first decade of the 20th century, and he says that let's convert or sort of revive this network and use it to fight the British. And so akhadas are called different names in different parts of the country. North India, it's called akhada, but for example, in the southern tip of India, it's called a kaladi, or in Assam, it's called a hatro. So there is a network of these across India and has already always existed. young men, sometimes women as well, went into these akhadas. And, they still exist in more traditional parts of our cities and villages. Varanasi.
It's more like an artistic form in many places, right? Like Kalaripayattu in
Yeah, but it
Kerala.
was not historically
Yeah.
a artistic thing.
Mm.
It was a real place to learn real martial arts for war.
Mm.
And the reason despite these hundreds of years of foreign occupation, there was always some resistance going on, had a lot to do with these akhadas.
Okay, and the connection with Anushilan Samiti?
Anushilan Samiti basically is this is the name by which, by the way, the revolutionaries call themselves. And why do they call themselves with a strange name? Because Anushilan Samiti literally means the discipline committee.
Mm.
That's because this is actually a network of these akhadas, where these young men, sometimes women as well, would basically meet each other, and these revolutionary ideas would spread. So this is what the revolutionary movement called itself, Anushilan Samiti. And of course, my family were involved in this akhadas, both. So this is my father's family, as I said.
The Varanasi.
In the Varanasi, they're running Bengali Tola, which means it's basically a Bengali school. There's still a Bengali Tola inter-college there set up by my family. And attached to that, there were these akhadas, which they also ran. So this is one branch of the family. And this branch included people like Sachindranath Sanyal, of course, very famously. But many of his cousins, brothers, the whole family were involved in this movement. And some of them I mentioned in the book.
Yeah.
Some of them I hint to. I actually didn't mention everybody because then it would begin sounding too much like a family history. So that's my father's family. And they were then thrown out of Varanasi, and all their properties were confiscated around about 1927
by the British.
By the British as a result of the Kakori conspiracy. And of course, Sachin Sanyal is sent off to Kalapani for the second time.
To cellular jail.
But what happens is that my branch of the family ends up in what is now Prayagraj, but then called Allahabad. And of course, there is a link to what happens then in Allahabad as well. It becomes a hub of revolutionary activities.
You also talk about that it was so traumatic that nobody ever from the Sanyal family lived in Varanasi again or something like that. To that
No,
extent.
it was not so much traumatic. We were just thrown out. So we
Thrown
didn't have anywhere to go back to.
So nothing.
Yeah.
Okay. But that whole process when he was sent to cellular jail was difficult. at that
Absolutely
time.
difficult because everybody's just uprooted and thrown out.
Right.
And then different people made their way. Another branch went off to Gorakhpur, by the way. So, and so on. And so in some sense, that our family then sort of dispersed.
There's one part, I'm going to come to this, which I had taken out. And, he says, nonetheless, Sanyal's main concern was to find, I'm reading it out. Nonetheless, Sanyal's main concern was to find a way to free the remaining political prisoners from cellular jail, in particular, Bhai Parmanand and Vinayak Savarkar.
Yes.
So then he goes and he says he met with Madan Mohan Malviya, gave him a patient hearing, but didn't offer any concrete. He gets disappointed. Sanyal gets disappointed. Then he goes to meet Jawaharlal Nehru in Gorakhpur. After hearing him out, Nehru commented, quote, "At a time when we are planning to go to jail, you want us to help others come out of prison?" This comment stunned Sanyal.
Yes.
And then he goes to Lala Lajpat Rai. He met Lala Lajpat Rai offers unconditional support. So here was your ancestor who was going pillar to post, trying to get people out of cellular jail because he had experienced it. Whereas the others who were the moderates, so-called moderates, they hadn't experienced that trauma.
Absolutely. So Sachin Sanyal, basically, he's my grand uncle, not my grandfather. He comes back from cellular jail. He is then one of the things he wants to do is to free all those people back that he has left behind. By the way, he describes how he felt somewhat guilty of being actually freed.
Yeah, the survivor's guilt.
Yes, the survivor's guilt. And he comes back and he's trying to explain to people that, look, cellular jail is not like any other jail. They are literally torturing people on a daily basis to break them. Yeah. They're working them to death. They are electrocuting them. They're just behaving atrociously with them. This is not like being sent off to the luxury wing of Naini jail or something like that.
Where you have books and
you
could listen to parrots and everything.
Yes, and or play badminton and other things. This is a serious place where you get tortured on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And then he suddenly realizes that nobody quite gets this. that cellular jail is a totally different ball game as a prison, and so he's trying in that passage. He's trying to basically incite some sort of a movement to try and free all these other people, but nobody seems to be listening to it. Finally, in 1920, he goes to the Nagpur session, and where he is able to make a call for freeing some of them, and not particularly successfully, because I think Savarkar, it takes several more years for Savarkar to be allowed to return to the mainland, many more years before he's actually freed, and so on.
So that Savarkar, what you write about Savarkar is also very moving. The torture that he faced and all. I mean, so many have written about, what about Savarkar's life. But every time I read something, it's a new facet. We spoke about your dad's side of the family. Let's go to the mom's side of the family now.
So my mom's side of the family, my mother's father's family, interestingly, their sort of they were the surname is Chakravarti, and my great grandfather was a gentleman called Mohini Mohan Chakravarti. Mohini Mohan Chakravarti's revolt against the British was actually to set up a cotton mill. And this is following
East Pakistan.
This is now in Bangladesh, in a place called Kushtia. It was at one stage one of the largest mills, cotton mills in Asia, called Mohini Mills.
How is it a rebellion?
It was a rebellion because he actually set it up as a part of the attempt to create indigenous industries following the 1905 Swadeshi Andolan. Now, why I want to make this point is quite interesting. Is, you see, the word Swadeshi has ended up being utilized as later on by Gandhiji as some sort of a return to the past, to a pre-modern utopia. But the original idea of Swadeshi was actually to be rapid modernization. And so there were many Indians, but specifically Bengalis, who went out there and began to sort of attempt to create new modern Indian enterprises. So Mohini Mills was an attempt to do exactly that, and he was very, very successful. It's a different matter. It fell on the wrong side of the border, and then.
So this is another interpretation of certain concepts
Yes.
that had a very linear explanation, as far as, like you said,
Yes.
about Swadeshi.
Yes.
That it was, we were told in our history texts in schools, was that it was this go back to the simplicity of wearing unstitched cloth and weaving your own cloth, but it wasn't that.
Absolutely. No, it's exactly the opposite. Because the original proponents of this line of thought, by the way, they're all linked to the revolutionary movement, because the revolutionaries, remember, are modernists. They are not attempting to go back to feudal India and the old nobility or whatever it is. They're entirely about moving forward to a democratic republic, and they're all about modernizing. Savarkar or Sri Aurobindo or Sachin Sanyal, they're all modernizers. And so this too is a form of rebellion. And then there is also my mother's family, which is even more closely linked to this whole thing, is my great-grandfather, Nalinaksha Sanyal, and his brother, Anadikanta Sanyal. They were members of the Anushalan Samiti, and then specifically...
How are they Sanyals?
Because my mother's family.
They were, okay.
They were also Sanyals.
So there's Chakravarti and Sanyal,
yes,
your mother's mother.
Yeah, and they're not related.
Okay.
They just have the same surname.
Okay.
And they came from Nadia, by the way. So there's a village there still called Doradaho. So they came from that village, the village boys, and they were academically good, so ended up in Kolkata. And Anadikanta Sanyal and Nalinaksha Sanyal got involved in an attempt to take out the Kolkata the police intelligence service, led by a gentleman called Tegart. And so they carried out a bunch of assassinations, and Anadikanta got captured. He was beaten to death in Rangpur jail and then died from his injuries. Nalinaksha, of course, carried on for some time, being a part of Bhagajotin's Jugantor group. And then later on, he would be brought into the Congress by C.R. Das. But he always had this sort of linkages through to the revolutionaries. And that's why he eventually also became very close to Netaji, because Netaji also had that sort of tilt.
So the book has a whole lot of this thing, these conversations and these linkages that you talk about. in an era where communication was so hard. It was so hard because there were no cell phones and there were no telephones. So of course, all that wasn't there. And then the intelligence network of the British.
Absolutely.
You talk about how, everything, there were informers, collaborators who just informed the Brits. And then those guys were sent off to cellular jail. It was like, oh, okay, they're going
If
to
they
do
were
something.
lucky, they were otherwise hanged or shot
Hanged.
dead.
Hanged and shot dead. Yeah, that part is very disturbing to
Yeah.
know that there were these collaborators, and I can sense, reading it, that there's another book coming on these collaborators. So tell me about that. When you were researching it, did it come as a shock to you? It came as a shock to me when I was reading it, but when you were researching it?
It didn't come as a shock. I mean, as I said, I grew up in an environment where some of this stuff was always murmured around.
Huh.
So, you know, I would be told that so and so person may be a great guy now, but this is his real history. So that kind of thing. So, I always had that kind of murmurings around me. But what I have done here is, as politely as possible, mentioned a few of them. Do remember that many of them and their descendants are still leading lights of our current elite. So I didn't want to unnecessarily provoke that and sort of take the conversation too far in that direction and then become controversial for a different reason. But fact of the matter is that after independence, the revolutionaries were deliberately pushed out of the national power structures, narratives, and everything.
So I have to come back to what you're saying. What you're saying is that the revolutionaries, their contribution was erased, and the collaborators, they are still part of the elite in India now?
Absolutely.
Okay, elaborate, please.
So what the interesting thing is, India becomes independent. It becomes independent because of a number of sort of efforts. It included various branches of the Congress. Congress was not just a monolithic party. Even the revolutionaries were inside the Congress in many places. And of course, the revolutionary movement, there are many other movements as well. But at the time of independence, however, the revolutionaries, first of all, did not have any senior leaders. All their senior leaders had been killed or had died for variety of reasons or gone missing, as in the case of Netaji. In addition to that, remember what happens to them. The two provinces that provided the most revolutionaries, Punjab and Bengal, actually get partitioned. Lahore, very important hub of revolutionary activity, Dhaka and East Bengal. So all these revolutionaries, far from thinking about grabbing power in Delhi, are suddenly homeless. So they're rushing around, their properties are being taken, their women are being raped, their houses are being burned down. So they have completely different concerns. And then one branch of the Congress party ultimately consolidates power, which is the Nehruvian branch. And in the 1950s, I have to say, and this is not just about the human sort of thing about trying to increase the importance of your own contributions. The Nehruvians go out of their way to actually wipe out the memory of other branches of resistance to the British, particularly the revolutionaries. So, for example, the cellular jail was almost entirely pulled down. The bits that you see today are just two radials. The rest was pulled down. And even these two radials were almost pulled down just in order to systematically remove all places of importance and memorials to the revolutionaries.
But why? They were dead, gone.
No, but the movement was still there. It involved hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, do remember the revolutionaries were capable of winning elections inside the Congress in the 1930s against the Gandhians. The Gandhians were, of course...
this moderate extremist bit.
Yeah, that's been going on for a long time.
Yeah. So they could have usurped power.
They were not a trivial thing. The problem that they faced was they had no unifying force. So they got scattered across from the left to the right, the communists on the left to the RSS on the right, and many branches of the Congress themselves. So what happens is that the Nehruvian branch of the Congress essentially comes to power. And they need allies. And who are their allies? Are the existing power structure made up of the collaborators. So suddenly, the same people, say the Imperial Police Service officers who were ordering firings against freedom fighters, suddenly they are the people who actually get promoted up when the British leave. In fact, in many cases, the British don't even leave. So it up to 1958,
They become part of the civil service, you mean?
they were part of the civil service
Okay.
in many cases.
Mm.
To start with, the imperial civil service was mostly made up of Indians by the 1930s and 1940s.
Yeah.
So the imperial police service that ordered firing in Mumbai during the naval revolt were mostly Indians. And all the contractors and others who were part of the British establishment, they actually were beneficiaries when the British left because they all got promoted up.
And you talk about that, you put pictures also of that naval revolt. Not many people know. I incidentally, trivia, but I was born there in Navy Nagar. And
nobody tells you, nobody
said
tells you that the single most important event that led to Indian freedom is the naval revolt of 1946. There is a very small memorial to it, and it's only in 2022 that the Navy actually celebrated it with a flotilla, with a float in Republic Day.
Yeah.
So what happens is that the collaborator class, do you remember that they, at independence, they are panicking? Because in every other country, like in Indonesia and other countries, they are usually evicted out of the power structure. Naturally, they were the people who were carrying
drain the swamp.
Yeah, drain the swamp. But in India, what happens in the name of continuity, and maybe one can say there was some need for continuity, but what happens is they are allowed to continue. And in fact, they get promoted because, as I said, as the British leave. And also the British don't always leave. Till 1958, the naval chief is British. That's why even after independence, the Navy flag continued to have the cross of St. George. So these things continue. So those power structures continue. And of course, they have already, they are incumbents in many ways. And they know English. So they have also the links with outside world as well. So
as I say, there was no truth commission. There's
no truth
inquiry.
commission. There's nothing. So these guys continue. In fact, they go out of their way to push out people who are not from their ilk. So the intellectual class, the first two generations of intellectual class in India, or the elite, other than some people made from the Nehruvian Congress. To be fair, the Nehruvian Congress had contributed to the freedom struggle. But other than them, the hangers on around just shift from collaborating with the British to collaborating with the new Nehruvian elite. But the Nehruvian elite is, of course, just one branch of the Congress. It's very small. So the rest of the elite actually is drawn from, the new elite is actually drawn from this collaborator class.
Have they gone away, fizzled out, or do you?
No, they're all they are still around in many ways.
They are.
They are still around. It requires just very little
scratch the surface.
Scratch the surface. A little bit of googling will tell you the ancestry of many of these people. So it's
okay. So we leave that for your next book, Sanjeev. But you were talking about how the revolutionaries kind of melted away. Because their properties went away with the partition. There's not much of documentation about the trauma that happened with the East Pakistan. There's a lot about the West Punjab and the East Punjab division and the trauma that happened there, but not much of literature which is there, or popular films and things made on that. But there was that too. You talked about how they had, the trauma. In your epilogue, I read about the PTSD part. Post-traumatic stress disorder, many of them had. And there was this one part which I'm just going to read out some parts of it, where you talked about the Maharashtrian Brahmin community.
Yes.
When Nathuram Godse was assassinated, then it unleashed a wave of mob violence against the Brahmin community across Maharashtra. Estimates vary, but thousands of homes and businesses were burnt down and hundreds were killed. When I read this, Sanjeev, I asked several friends of mine and all, did you know this? Many of them are married to Maharashtrians. Many of them, I come from Bombay. We've lived among, nobody knew about it. It's not because they were ill-informed or anything. It's just that it wasn't there in the school text. So then it
also what happens just with partition families, they'll tell you, partition families tend to say very little about the moment of partition because it's such a major trauma.
True.
They very often don't tell their children what they went through. very clearly, or very passingly they will mention it because they want to wipe it out of them.
Yes.
So the same thing happened with the Maharashtrian Brahmins, another community that provided a lot of revolutionaries, incidentally.
Yeah.
And when a member of their community assassinated Gandhiji, and I'm not condoning in any way that was the right thing, it was the wrong thing to have done. But what followed was also wrong, and it's never talked about, which is this massive rioting against the Maharashtrian Brahmin community, where, as I said, hundreds were killed, thousands of homes, businesses, etc., were burnt down. Savarkar's brother, Narayan, was dragged out of his house and stoned to death. I mean, eventually
and
died.
it was a Congress mob.
It was. And this is why it
You
is
mentioned
important.
that. He says that a large mob of Congress party workers turned up at the home of Narayan Rao Savarkar, dragged him out in the streets. They beat and stoned him mercilessly before leaving him in a pool of blood. And then he said, and then you write about how they went looking for Vinayak Savarkar at his house in Dadar. This is there by others also, but it's still, disturbing. Where he was staying with his wife Yamuna and son Vishwas on the first floor. As the mob stormed into the ground floor, they were delayed long enough by a couple of supporters to allow the police to arrive. This likely saved the family from meeting the same fate as Narayan Rao. And then you write about PTSD, and having suffered years of torture in prison and then partition, many former revolutionaries suffer from what we today call post-traumatic stress disorder. And then you write about Ulaskar Dutt. Now, I want you to, this was, of course, that he was so severely tortured in cellular jail that he almost lost his mind. He talks about repeated electrocutions. And when those electrocutions were happening, he was thinking about Leela.
Yes. So I'll tell you the story.
Now tell me the story about Leela, because it is heartbreaking.
So Ulaskar Dutt was the expert bomb maker in the first generation of the Anushilan Samiti. And after the Alipur bomb case, 1909, 1910, he sent off to Kalapani. Now, as I told you, cellular jail wasn't just any old jail. It was designed to break people. And there were hundreds of these revolutionaries, and they were systematically put through torture, mental and physical. Now, after several years there, obviously, Ulaskar Dutt's health broke down, and he was severely ill at some point in time, running high fever. And he simply refused to run the oil mill, which was one of the ways they would force physical labor on them. And so the jail warden and his accomplices, said, no, he's just putting on an act, which is odd. You could always tell when somebody is running high fever. Anyway, so they drag him off and they begin to electrocute him. They tie him to a chair and they are electrocuting him, and he's screaming. And the rest of the jail can hear him screaming. And by the way, this is deliberate because he's being made an example of, right? So it's not like the British want to hide this. They want the rest of the prisoners to hear. And through the electrocution, he keeps collapsing. So they wait for him to revive and again put him through this. And eventually he loses his mind after days and days of going through electrocution. He loses his mind. The other prisoners, by the way, go on hunger strike and so on. And so finally, when the news of all of this begins to leak out, the British authorities decide, okay, we'll let him off, but he's lost his mind. So they send him off to Madras, now Chennai, to a mental asylum to recover. But it takes him many, many years to recover. Now, while he's doing all of this, do remember what is happening. What is keeping him sane? The image of Leela. So who is Leela? Leela was his college sweetheart, who was the daughter of Bipin Pal, another very famous nationalist,
Lal Bal
Pal era leader. So he's the Pal of the Lal Bal Pal, and was his classmate. And they were engaged to get married when he was arrested on the Alipur jail case. And so throughout all this torture, he sees this drifting image of Leela in front of him. And that's what that's the only thing that keeps him going through these years of first torture in jail, then this electrocution, this period of mental instability and all of that. And so he comes out after many, many years, when he recovers enough, and goes looking for Leela. And of course, he finds that Leela...
Which year are we talking about?
We are talking now many years...
Post-independence.
No, they are still well in the independence. Maybe in the early 1920s.
Correct.
So he goes off looking for Leela. And Leela, of course, had waited for him for many years, but he had gone off to cellular jail, no communications. She was unaware of all the tortures he went through. She was unaware what happened to him afterwards. And so after waiting for many years, she then decided maybe he had died or whatever. And she had married somebody else and was living in Bombay, now Mumbai. So Ullas Dutt is obviously, sad, but what can he do? So he sort of drifts back, and he still rejoins the revolutionary movement after all of this. Gets arrested, does various things, and then at the time of independence and partition, he's living in his village in East Bengal, in East Pakistan, and he becomes a refugee. So when he sort of becomes a refugee and he moves to now independent India, somebody tells him that Leela is now a widow and is paralyzed from waist down. So he hunts her down in Bombay and finds her, takes him with her to Assam, Silchar, where his family, or he sets up his new home, and marries her, and then looks after her till she dies.
Wow.
So eventually she did marry her.
What a love story, right? I mean,
Absolutely. And you could not have made this up.
yeah.
I mean, if I did this in a movie, it would,
Yeah.
people think it's just not believable, but this is a true story.
I know. So, in the beginning of the book, when you mentioned him and you said that more about their love later. So I was like, where is this going to come in? And then it comes right at the epilogue. It was very touching. There's also the story of Beena Das. Tell us about that before I go to Komagato Maro.
Beena Das was one of the daughters of Beni Madhav Das, who was, by the way, the teacher of Netaji, and one of the reasons Netaji went in the nationalistic sort of stream. So now Beena Das, incidentally, used to practice shooting in what is now Hindustan Park area in Baliganj in Kolkata with my great-grandmom. That's Nalinaksha Sanyal's wife. And they used to shoot regularly. And then
Was this common, tell me, for women to go for?
Well, I doubt that was common enough, but I do remember these are not common people. They are clearly, they are both, Nalinaksha Sanyal and Beena Das's father were both linked to the revolutionaries. They were not, and so they were probably routinely handling various kinds of guns and bombs. And
That's what I was
like
going to ask. How did it work for these women? The reason I'm asking Beena's story is because of that. Like, I mean, yahan pe to party mein jao to mom will say, what time are you coming back? What time are you going? But these women were going about,
well, I can tell you, my great grandfather was not quite ordinary person. I mean, he was himself involved in various revolutionary activities.
And how emancipated that they wanted their women also. They didn't put their women in, at the back of the room and say, cook for us.
Incidentally, since I knew my great grandmother, who we used to call Mamuni, she was quite a formidable lady. She was, I think, 5 foot nothing, but possibly the only person Nalinaksha Sanyal was afraid of. She was quite a character. So it's not completely out of character that she was out there practicing shooting with Beena Das. But anyway, Beena Das then goes off on graduation day in Calcutta University. She pulls out this revolver and shoots 5 bullets at the governor of Bengal and misses. But she's arrested, of course, and sent off to jail for 9 years. My great-grandmom, of course, would claim that if she had been the one shooting it, she would not have missed. Now, that is, of course, a very troubling idea, because if that had happened, I may not have existed either.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. I'm going to read out this one portion when we talk about the Gadarites. You say this, that the whole episode, you talk about the Komagato Maro and, bringing the Granth Sahib on the, he carried it on his head and things. And you said that the whole episode sent shockwaves, because of what happened then. I'm not going to go into the details about that, what that Komagato Maro incident is. People can Google it and read it if you have not read it before. You write about this and you say that the whole episode sent shockwaves across India and the diaspora. In Canada, a group of Gadarites decided to kill those they suspected of working for British intelligence. One by one, their bodies were found. This included Arjan Singh, Then there's Bela Singh. Then you talk about Meva Singh, a Gadarite, pulled out a gun and shot him dead. Meva was immediately arrested, condemned to death. Bela would survive a couple of more assassination attempts in Canada before being killed in Punjab later. Tell me about this whole Gadarites and what happened then, and their links, the links of what happened in that period to the origins of the Khalistanis in Canada.
So, all this while we were talking about the revolutionaries within India, but do remember the revolutionaries were spread all over the world. They had links to foreign governments like the Germans, the Turks, the Japanese, to other freedom movements like those of the Irish, and they were operating in places like the west coast of Canada and the US, California and British Columbia. And in British Columbia and Canada, they functioned through a network of gurudwaras. Like in India, they were functioning through a network of akhadas. In North America, they were functioning through a network of gurudwaras, where there were a group of nationalist Sikhs, Punjabis more generally, but specifically Sikhs, who were sort of pushing for Indian freedom. They were providing financing. They were personally willing to pick up arms and move to India, and doing all kinds of things were going on. And remember the context as well. A significant proportion of those fighting in the First World War for the British cause in Europe were Sikhs. So this was not just yet another community that was involved in all of this. So there was this simmering tension, and of course the British intelligence yet again was fully aware that this was a dangerous thing from their perspective. So what they did is interesting. They got hold of a secret agent called Hopkinson. And Hopkinson began to infiltrate these gurudwaras in British Columbia. And he was given a huge amount of resources to essentially find out loyalist Sikhs, particularly those who were willing to use these resources he was giving to create first a wedge between the Hindu community and the more hardcore Sikh community. And so till that point in time, the Hindu Sikh community was basically indistinguishable. It was more a spectrum than clearly separate. And so you see that begin to happen in the UK, but more importantly in Canada. And so, of course, the Gadarites were aware that this was going on, and so they begin to shoot these informers and British agents in their midst. And there are these gunfights in the gurudwaras. Ultimately, what happens is that Bela Singh, who was one of the collaborators, he panics and he shoots a bunch of Gadarites inside a gurudwara in British Columbia, and he's captured. The British cannot hang him and punish him because he is one of theirs. So they do a show trial, and everybody knows that Bela Singh is going to be released at the end of the show trial. So the court happens, and Hopkinson turns up to give testimony on his behalf. But while he is about to do this, another Sikh, Gadarite, pulls out a revolver and shoots him dead. And then he also attempts to kill Bela Singh, but doesn't manage. Anyway, Meva Singh is captured. He's hanged. Sadly, nobody remembers Meva Singh in India, but he was, he basically, in my view, should be celebrated.
He died in Punjab much later. Right?
No, Meva Singh didn't. Meva. He was hanged.
He was hanged.
He was hanged. Bela Singh, the collaborator. Bela Singh, however, found that it was too dangerous for him to be in Canada because there were all these Gadarite Sikhs hunting for him. He decides then that it's actually better for him to go back to Punjab, where it's actually safer, where he can sort of disappear in the woodwork among the general population. But even there, he's hunted down by the revolutionaries and killed. But what happens as a result of this is that there is this this group of British loyalist Sikhs who slowly take control of the gurudwaras with British support, both in Canada and in the UK. And this idea of Khalistani movement, interestingly, even today, comes from exactly those same gurudwaras that had been infiltrated with Hopkinson 100 years ago. So this is the source of your Khalistani movement. So in case you're wondering, why on earth would Canada be the center of Khalistani movement of all places on earth? Well, this is the reason. Now also the UK as well, same reason.
So there's a historical, contextual connection between these
Absolutely.
But didn't the people then want to weed away these elements in their gurdwaras?
No, so this tussle continued, as I said. It was a brutal tussle. But in the end, I mean, this tussle still remains. I mean, it's still there.
At your book release event in New Delhi, the Home Minister said that, and I quote this: India's independence is a collective result of efforts, but one-sided narrative was imposed on the masses through education, legends, and writing of history. And he also said we have to extract history from the streams of extremists versus moderates and make it realistic. What is realistic, Sanjeev? Because there are many who are saying that there's a lot of rewriting which is happening, and it is pandering to a narrative now. It's a populist narrative.
So my view is that, look, let the facts all come out. Everybody is allowed an opinion, but you're not allowed your own facts. Whatever I've written in my book are very easily verifiable. I've given resources as references at the back. You can check those out. Or you can go and do your own research. You will find that they are completely and solidly backed by facts. I mean, you can quibble about the things on the edges, but the broad narrative that I have put together in this book is, and in other books as well, has never been overturned by anybody. So my view is, I am not saying that the peaceful movement led by Mahatma Gandhi had no role in our freedom struggle. That is not the case. I have therefore not called this book the alternative story. I've called it the other story, by which I'm saying that, look, yes, there was a non-violent movement, but there was this other armed struggle as well, which was an important part of our history. We should know about it, and all these amazing people who gave their lives fighting for our freedoms.
So, what happens is that the new interpretations which are coming out are digging up things which nobody remembers, or it was deliberately done, which you mentioned, J. Sai Deepak mentions, Vikram Sampath, and many other historians, the new age historians, they are saying that it was deliberately done. What happens also is that religious identities come into clash over these historic narratives. Now, I can give you, it could be about the Mughals, it could be about Tipu Sultan, and now when elections come, then it's resurrected again. So was there a deliberate attempt that let's put band-aid over all this, because it's just going to cause...
Well, putting band-aid doesn't help. Whatever the history was history. This is what the facts are. Lying about them doesn't help at all. I mean, just to give you an example, there is no evidence that Tipu Sultan was fighting for Indian independence. I mean, he was going quite happy to write letters to the Turkish Sultan asking for help. So he's asking for help from all kinds of foreign groups. And the people he was fighting were not only the British. He was fighting the Nizam, he was fighting the Marathas, he was fighting the Travancore. More than adequate evidence that he was doing atrocities against fellow Indians. Very little evidence that he was fighting for Indian independence. So if your purpose is to look for Muslim patriots, then let me put some others. Why not Ashfaqullah Khan? Yeah. Right? Here's a man who he was part of the Hindustan Republican Association and was hanged for the Kakuri case. So the problem here is that if you really want to dig in, you'll find all kinds of other things as well. But this peculiar skewed narrative, it doesn't really help, because it doesn't convince anyone. Even a mild scratching of the surface of history shows you that these narratives are false.
It's like when they talk about Mughals, it's nobody celebrates Dara Shikoh. Whereas...
Not just that. I mean, we start with this utter absurdity of trying to celebrate Babur was Indian because he died here and did not take our money and go away. Well, he actually wanted to. He couldn't find his way back to Central Asia. Road was blocked. And for many generations after that, the Mughals did try to make their way back. By the way, an expedition was led even by Aurangzeb when he was a prince to try and make their way back to Bukhara. So,
and then they didn't come here to loot and plunder. They came here to make this,
to civilize us or something. But this is absurd. You read Tuzuki Barbari, or Babur Nama in Persian, and Babur is absolutely clear why he came to India. He came for the gold. He says so himself. So you see, what happens here is that two things. One is this is false, and it doesn't cut any ice. Secondly, what you have done here is that you have then painted the idea that their Muslim identity overrides everything else, and that somehow Indian Muslims of today must somehow identify with Babur because he was a Muslim. Now, this is a very dangerous line of thought. So let me explain why. This is exactly the mistake that Mahatma Gandhi did during the Khilafat movement. What was he doing? He was basically asking Muslims to join the freedom struggle, not on the basis of their freedom, but on the basis of their allegiance to
Islamic
the
linkages.
Turkish Caliph, Turkish Sultan, who was also considered the Caliph. So the point I'm making is that this is a very slippery slope. And I think it is unnecessarily foisted on the Indian Muslim, most of them are descendants of Indians, not of Turkic invaders.
But it's something that Pakistan did, right? When they were doing their history narration.
So they have done it. So they have done this absurd thing. They name their missiles after Ghori and Ghazni and so on. Now, this is crazy because read your own history. Your own great grandfather, grandmother were killed, raped, etc. by these people. So why are you celebrating? This is a bizarre form of Stockholm syndrome.
There's also this talk that because of these new narratives which are coming, that Indian academia is confused, conflicted. Is the architecture of Indian academia so weak that it can't take on these multiple narratives now?
Well, there was a longish period when there was sort of an ethnic cleansing of alternative narratives in Indian academia.
Interesting.
So, and by the way, this has happened around about the world. I mean, the amount of ideological diversity, even in Western universities, is just ridiculous. But you still have the odd thinker who may not conform. But in India, it was absolute complete cleansing. And this started from the 1950s. You saw, in the economics field, for example, you had the likes of B.R. Shenoy, just pushed out because he wanted more market. You wanted to bring in this somewhat entirely socialist kind of thing. So, and you see that also in the history writing. R.C. Majumdar is pushed out from being the chairman of the writer of the official history of
his books were not available for a long time.
Yes, so this was done in a neat and clean way, and since there were nobody in academia over a period of time, they completely cleaned it out. The only way you will get alternative narratives now is from outside of academia. Of course, now new people may emerge over time, but I and Vikram and Sai, etc., always criticized, but you are not a trained historian. Well, if I was subjected to that training, I would have been brainwashed. Basically, what you're objecting to is that I didn't get subjected to the same amount of brainwashing. That's maybe why I'm able to write outside of the official narratives. But a massive system of brainwashing in the name of sort of historiography and of course patronage systems in terms of papers and seminars and doctorates, etc., was that machinery was created. That machinery, by and large, is to a large extent still alive. But what is happening is that outside of that controlled environment, other narratives are popping up.
So now that we're talking about your other hats and how it's held against you, so let's get on to that. You're a numbers person.
Yes.
So why did you abandon that? Have you abandoned that? No, your regular job is that.
Yes.
So tell me, give me some gyan now on this bank collapse which has happened. How safe is Indian money, especially of the startups, and how can India prevent this kind of a thing happening here?
What's happening with the Silicon Valley Bank? I'm presuming that's what you mean.
Yes.
And the other smaller banks that have also gone under in as we speak in the US. This is precisely what we were warning the world about, including the US. So you go back to the COVID period, and you will see leading economists, including some who have won Nobel Prizes like Stiglitz and Krugman, and of course many NRI economists based in the West, telling us, go out there and spend helicopter money, monetary and fiscal expansion, it does not matter, and so on. And you will remember that many of us who were in government, and myself personally, we were continuously saying, bad idea. This is not a demand side shock to start with. This is a supply side shock. And pushing in all this fiscal and monetary resources in this massive burst is going to create bubbles. So what has happened is, first of all, many developing countries have gone under, Pakistan or Egypt or Sri Lanka and so on. But even developed countries have ended up with massive debts. And also this rush of liquidity in then created all this dislocation in the Silicon Valley Bank as one example of it. What happened? They got a lot of money. They didn't know what to do with this. So they put them, I can't believe they did it, very frankly. They stuffed them into long bonds. Now, anybody who has even done the first undergraduate class of any bond maths in their finance, when they're doing their finance course, will know that any increases in interest rates will lead the bonds to crash.
Collapse,
and the
yes.
longer the bonds, the worse that crash is going to be. I mean, if they were forced to do something with that money, maybe put it at very short-term bonds or whatever, of short-term instruments of some sort. So instead, they put them in these 10-year treasuries. And inevitably, when interest rates went back, the prices of those bonds collapsed, and essentially they went bankrupt.
Yeah.
Now, this is really toddler-level mistake. And I can't believe this happened. But do remember that we were being advised to do this here in India. And in some ways, this is, in a slightly different way, is what we actually did do following the financial crisis of 2007-8. We had gone out there and done this massive amount of lending, and it had created bubbles, and it had led to all kinds of NPAs in our system, which, I was part of the team that went through it in 17, 18, 19, cleaning it up. So what I'm trying to say here is that we were being advised to do things would have inevitably led to exactly the things you are now seeing in the US and in Europe and other countries and the UK. All of them now have extremely constrained fiscal systems. They don't know what to do because they've already committed so much resources, massively over-indebted, inflation that is not in control. They're trying to control it by tightening monetary policy, but their banking system now cannot suddenly take this tightening. So, one of the important lessons here is never lose track of macroeconomic stability. And the true test of economic character is being able to hold it together when you are under severe stress. And I think we passed that test.
The true test. Why didn't the ratings agencies, why did they give them A ratings and stuff like that? The bank.
This is a common problem. And this happens because of two reasons. The first reason is often more sort of played up, is that their incentive structure is to give everybody a very high rating, because then, the person who gets rated pays. So you want to give them the best rating possible. And so there's an incentive structure problem. And there is a lot of debate about the agency problem, incentive structures, etc. But in my view, this is only one part of the problem. The other part of the problem, a more severe problem, is that even if you sorted out all these agency problems, it wouldn't do anything, is that, frankly, the future is unknowable. So therefore, what you need to do is to create buffers in the system in various ways and really look through their balance sheets and stress test them over and over again. And that is unfortunately not done very much. So it's not the case just that the rating agencies have an incentive problem. Many cases, they genuinely don't know what's happening. And so,
but that's their job.
That's their job, but they don't do a good job of it. And I have written extensively on why, unfortunately, we end up taking these ratings way too seriously and hardwiring it into policy. So now what happens in these situations is suddenly everybody's ratings go down. So you have to force capital onto it in the banking system. That causes further tightening and so on and so forth. So instead, the ratings now become pro-cyclical. So just when you need more capital is when you are having these ratings downgrades, and even banks which are otherwise fine will suddenly find that they have to tighten things up. And when the whole system does this, you actually cause the problem to worsen. And it's in some ways negating what the Fed is trying to do, was putting liquidity in.
Could it happen in India too?
Well, anything can happen, but we have put in a lot of trouble to try and create all those buffers over the years. We created the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. We took the trouble of taking very large companies through the insolvency process. We reinstated creditor rights. Much of this was painful in the years 17, 18, you will remember, or even 19.
Yeah.
You will remember.
That was the time you came to India.
That was the time I came to India. And one of the first things I did was to look through the dirty dozen of these large corporations that have run up huge debts. And of course, to do some, by the way, the term dirty dozen was my application to to this.
I remember reading about it. Yeah.
Yes. So the problem was, of course, that our back in 2015-16, our banks were stuffed with all this NPAs. And the problem was that everybody said, now, oh my God, what we're going to do with it? We have this new Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, and but it's never been tested. So one of the conventional ideas of that time was, okay, there's a lot of this stuff that thousands of these NPAs, tens of thousands of crores of bad loans, etc. What are we going to do about it? And the conventional wisdom was, let's take a few relatively small cases through the system, test it out, and then we'll try the bigger cases. Now, my view on this was, look, the complicatedness of a case is uncorrelated to its size.
Okay.
Okay. You can have a very large bankruptcy, but maybe a very relatively simple case. So rather than take a small case through it, why not take the biggest cases through it? Because we did some analysis in the finance ministry, and we discovered 50 cases accounted for 2/3 of the problem. In fact, a dozen cases accounted for between 25 and 30% of the problem. So
resolve this first.
So my argument was, look, surely, no matter how bad this insolvency and bankruptcy system is and how untested it is, surely it could deal with 12 cases. Right? So we then focused on just those 12 cases, which, as I said, we dubbed as the dirty dozen. Okay. And those were then those cases did go through the
there was this one seminar, this a reform agenda for 2047.
Yes.
In that, you said that in the olden days of the Planning Commission, the government was telling what the private sector should do, was telling the private sector what to do. But, and I quote, you said, that's not how we think about policy making anymore. And then you said that the role of the government is to provide leadership where necessary, infrastructure where essential. Now, is that the goal that the Prime Minister has laid out till 2047? How are you guys working? Is this what it is, minimum government?
Yes. So this is essentially a restating of the minimum government, maximum governance point, which is that it isn't the business of the government to run everything. And unlike in the past, wise men sitting in planning commission telling everybody how they should live their lives. The job of the government is to provide the playing ground, but it is not to be, for the most part, a player. It can provide the playing ground. It can create regulators. You can call them the umpires or referees. It can prepare the ground. It can maybe even sell the TV rights or whatever it is. But actually playing of the match, the government, by and large, in most cases, does not have a role. And that is a principle that we have, by and large, used in the last 30 years of reforms. That has basically been what we have done. So since 1991 to now, what has really been, when we said reform and we said liberalization, we meant roughly the same thing. The reason is that the last 30 years of reform was about removing the Indian state from the things it should not be doing. And to a large extent, this is now done. I mean, there are the odd things, but the principle of privatization, for example, is not a matter of debate. I mean, it's now a matter of the tactical act of actually selling.
The criticism comes with that, right? I mean, yes, everybody agrees privatization necessary, road sports we need, right? But then comes that accusation that when you're privatizing, when you're asking the private sector to build your roads and ports, there's crony capitalism which is happening.
No, so therefore the point is you auction these things and do it in as transparent a way as you have to. And of course, asking the state itself to do it does not remove rent seeking. So that is, rent seeking is a problem, whether you do it by the state or not by the state. That's,
But there's the old guard which used to say that when Panditji bid the Navratnas, there was no.
I think you may want to read a little bit about something called the Mundra scandal, which happened in 1955, which was exposed, interestingly, by his son-in-law, Feroz Gandhi. And the then finance minister, TTK, had to resign. So it is not the case that there wasn't corruption. There was corruption right from the beginning. In fact, this is in an economic case, there was corruption in even in defense deals. The Jeep scandal happened in 1948. So there was plenty of corruption about, and it was much debated at that time. But coming back to your point, the last 30 years of reforms is about withdrawing the Indian state from the things it should not do. The next 25 years till 2047 should be about getting the Indian state to do the things it should do. And there are a whole bunch of things we need to do reforms in order to do that. First, most important thing we need to do is legal system reform. It's not a part of the executive, but certainly judiciary is an important part of the Indian state. Enforcement of contract, delivery of justice is an important role that the Indian state needs to do. But having 40 million cases stuck in the pipeline is not the way it's getting done. So we have to, this is a reform that has to happen. Of course, in any kind of reform, there'll be all kinds of dimensions about a tussle between the government and judiciary, and all these things will also happen. But
it's got to be done.
It's got to be done. And the people of this country have got to demand it. Yes, they should also keep track of that the government does not politicize it and all that. That too. But you cannot now avoid it.
Okay.
This reform of the judiciary system, whether it happens from inside, happens because of the government, happens because of public pressure, or some combination of the three, or in part, and preferably in part that all these three are in partnership, that would be perfect. But some sort of reform of the judicial system has to happen.
Okay.
Number one. Number two, we also now need to do something about reforming the administrative system and the bureaucracy. Here too, every government around the world needs an administrative system, a bureaucracy, and so on to basically run the country. Yeah, the general administration of the country. So saying that, get rid of the bureaucracy eventually doesn't work. Every country has some sort of a bureaucracy. The problem is that the Indian bureaucracy was created under colonial rule, and its purpose was not service delivery, but control. Right? Naturally, there were small elite ruling the country. And now what happens is that we become independent. This bureaucracy, however, becomes very useful as also the tool for a socialist system of economic planning and running the government. So we go from one control system to an even more control system where it needs licenses and permits and all kinds of other things. So the bureaucracy actually, rather than become weaker, actually becomes even more powerful. Now, 1991 comes along. And since 1991, what has happened is that there has been a rollback of the state. So the rollback of the powers of the bureaucracy. But the reducing of the powers of the bureaucracy doesn't mean the bureaucracy has been reformed. It's just given less powers. I mean, you don't need to go to a gazetted officer anymore to get all kinds of things signed. So he has been withdrawn, or she has been withdrawn, but they have not been reformed.
The power.
Yeah. So what you now need to do is to go through administrative reforms to get the bureaucracy to be designed not for control, but for delivery of service.
Police reforms included in this.
Police reforms are also part of this. This. So generally getting the machinery to be service oriented, i.e. today, there's no point in complaining that the bureaucracy is not delivering, because it's not designed to do this. And no individual, there may be individual, IAS officer or IPS officer was particularly good and forward looking, etc. But that can't be the basis of this.
No, yeah.
See, we are all trying to improve the individuals.
No,
Not ne-
system
the
overhaul.
system does not
Yeah.
so
Hmm.
you
There's
ask
an overhaul that you
absolutely you
Okay.
take how does a district get run? It gets run by a district magistrate or district collector.
Yeah.
Average district magistrate is 33 years old, 34 years old, very junior person, has no experience and ever running anything.
Yeah.
Suddenly is made the virtual king of that district.
Yeah.
He or she is there for 2 years. That absolutely has no chance of even finding out half the things that need to be done. And inevitably, he or she is made chairman of every third committee in that district. And they probably haven't had chance to even attend one meeting or chair one meeting of whatever that subject is.
Yeah.
So we need to, for example, make the district magistrate a more senior role. Allow people to be there for longer periods of time and take this as this is the cutting edge of administration, right?
Okay.
So there are many things that need to be done.
Okay. So judicial reforms, admin reforms.
I mean, I can keep going.
You can keep
these,
going. Okay.
But these two reforms are absolutely critical. Getting the Indian state to deliver the things it's supposed to do, justice, and then of course administration, which includes of course municipal administration, other policing, and other things.
You're very active on social media, Sanjeev. So a couple of questions which I have, which came up, which I've seen you respond also. This whole thing that these reforms will be carried out, or these changes are being carried out because of electoral autocracy. There's this term which is being bandied a hell of a lot, where it says that because the BJP has the numbers, they are thrusting this down the throats of people where there is no consensus in the country about these things.
So all democracy is supposed to be through majorities, no? As long as a certain class had the majority in parliament, not necessarily majority of population voting for them, and a majority in parliament, even if it was in coalition, they thought it was democracy. When they get voted out for a variety of reasons, this elite now suddenly finds that democracy isn't such a useful thing after all. So, and by the way, it's not only in India, many places in the world, what's happening is that the idea of liberal democracy is that self-certified liberals win, right? So whenever the self-certified liberals don't win, then it becomes you have to create these oxymorons like electoral autocracy. I mean, it's just completely absurd things. The idea itself is absurd. So, this is, by the way, as part of a much more systematic thing that we are seeing worldwide. And I've written about this, by the way. I've written working papers, articles about this, how we are seeing systematically a narrative built against India, whether it's by VDEM or EIU or Freedom House, all of them, by the way, funded by nebulous private charities such as the Soros's Open Society, etc. And they have the same narrative filtering through systematically. So this is also part of a global power game in which we have no choice but to participate. But we have to be out there and keep questioning all these
power. We have to participate. Like, why?
Because you see, we cannot ignore these things. So let me explain this. Many of these indices, like the ones that I just mentioned, these institutions publish a whole bunch of things, index on global freedom, index on democracy, academic freedom, and so on. And you will see India is always rated as low as possible.
Yeah.
So, you have 140 countries.
It's very annoying.
Yeah, 140 countries ranked on democracy. India is 108.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or we are rated on academic freedom below Afghanistan and Pakistan. I mean, just imagine.
Yeah.
So there's obviously not even a pretense of being objective about this whole matter. So I began writing about this for some time now, and the response is also quite funny. The VDEM's director basically comes and doesn't respond to any of my criticisms. Instead says, no, our things must be right because we use high maths and a supercomputer to work this out. So why do you need a supercomputer? All you did was took opinions of 25 people. That's it. I mean, a survey of 25 people to decide on how the world should be ranked. You've got to be kidding me. So this is the level of operations that is happening. But all this while, we never called them out. And a lot of people's view was, ignore them. You can't ignore them. I'll tell you why. Because you see, many of these things get slyly hardwired into real life things. So, for example, all these indices by VDEM, EIU, Freedom House, many others, they eventually end up in something called the World Bank's World Governance Indicators. Now, this in turn is 20% of the weightage at many of our sovereign ratings. And sovereign ratings have an impact on the
On
rate at which
FDI,
we,
everything.
on kinds of things. This is therefore a kind of power that is in a secondary way managing narratives is used by these nebulous funders to essentially manage the world, let's say. And this is, by the way, being extended. So please take this seriously. There's something called ESG norms. You will see this everywhere from now on. It's called environment, social, and governance norms. And there is a very strong lobby worldwide trying to put these norms and indicators and indices into investment decisions, trade decisions. And so they will be used against us.
Why?
Well, because it serves various purposes in terms of, you see, India is a rising power, and we don't seem to be listening to, Western narratives, or at least of the deep states in many of these countries. And so many of the deep state and corporate and geostrategic interests will want to trip us. I mean, we should expect this to happen, but I'm just telling you that do not be blind to what is a very well-oiled machinery.
Okay.
And this is not just happening in these perception indices, by the way. We have talked about perception indices, but I will be in the next few days also publishing a working paper on how this happens even in hard data. So when you see the UN population division calculating India's, expected, expected life expectancy at birth, or ILO is calculating female labor participation, or WHO is creating a global standard for stunting, and then it gets into all these global hunger index and all of this.
Yeah. And of course, freedoms.
No, freedoms and all that perception. So all those perception ones, there's a lot of debate. There's also Professor Babonas who's also been raising this. I've been raising it for years. So there's at least some understanding, some pushback that these opinion-based stuff is dodgy.
Okay, but now the
hard data ones are also dodgy.
Okay.
And as I said, I'm going to publish a paper very, very shortly. I've been writing about it in newspapers and otherwise, but I'm publishing a working paper very shortly where I will show you even this hard data is systematically tainted. And one of the sad facts is that our own data agencies are participating in it by not applying their minds to many of these global sort of standards and so on. There's no pushback from our own data agency. So one of the things I'm trying to do is to get there be a much greater consciousness in the government and in non-government data agencies in India that when you apply global standards, sometimes they are good, sometimes they are not so good, sometimes they are appropriate. So it's not always they're inappropriate. But there seems to be something very odd that of the many, many of these indices which I went through, you never find there being an error on the upside. The error is always to the downside.
To the downside.
Okay. Now, how can that be possible?
Yeah.
So I think there has to be some investigation into the matter. Now, some part of it may be simply, not some grand conspiracy, just that sectoral interest in that sector wants to exaggerate how big that problem is in that sector because they then get grants both from the government or private sector or international grants by exaggerating the problem. So that is one part of the problem, certainly, because I found that in many of these cases, the people in that sector are aware of this. But there doesn't seem to be any great interest in correcting the error.
So, Sanjeev, I was talking about, the many hats you wear. Now, you came back to India in 2017, and there were many like you who, came in 2014 and 2017 to be part of Mr. Modi's agenda or the BJP's agenda for India in the next decade or whatever they had their plans. It reminded me a lot about when Rajiv Gandhi came to power. he invited a whole bunch of young people saying, come and be part of the India story. Pakistanis say that that happened when Benazir Bhutto came to power. She also got a whole, all these educated elites of Pakistanis who were working in England, who were working in the US, saying, "Come be part of the Pakistan story." Um, did that inspire you in some way when Mr. Modi came to power? That you want to be here, you want to be in India. What was it that made you leave a relatively cushy job and come to India?
So let me say that India has a longish tradition of this, by the way. So they have, at least in the space of economists, so let me just stick to that part. You saw, for example, Manmohan Singh is also part of that
Yes.
phenomena. Then you had a generation that happened around about the liberalization time, a little bit before, when you had Montek Singh, Vijay Kelkar, and others who came. So there was also that. And then later on, you had briefly Raghuram Rajan, for example, came. He went back. But so there has been a history, at least in the field of economics, of Indians living outside of India or leaving their jobs, coming back and carrying on here and being quite successful. I mean, Manmohan Singh went on and became Prime Minister, but some of them didn't stay. I mean, some of them went back, like Arvind Subramaniam, Raghu went back as well. So there's a mixed bag, but the idea of people coming and participating in the India story is a well-established one, well before me. In my personal case, of course, I've been very much aligned to a particular way of thinking about the India, its economy, and so on. And of course, the term right wing is bandied about. And I understand that it doesn't always exactly translate into the Indian context, but for the lack of
conservatives, maybe
or nationalist or whatever you may want to call it. Anyway, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So there is a group of thoughts which I subscribe to, which aligns with certainly what Prime Minister Modi is trying to do. And so I had actually met him even before he became Prime Minister, when he was in Gujarat. And of course, when he comes to power, I was very, very happy. And then at some point in time, I had the opportunity of joining this Finance Minister Jaitley's team, and then I served under him as Principal Economic Advisor. Then Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman after him. And then a year ago, I then shifted to become Prime Minister Modi's economic member of his Economic Council. So that's been my journey. I have to say it's been absolutely fabulous. I don't know what the others think about it. Maybe they have to put up with a somewhat idiosyncratic character, but I have had a great time.
I always like to know about the author, not just about the book. What leads you to write about Indian history? You're an economist. You have a day job which is so exhausting because you're working on on transforming the Indian economy. What is it that you do that inspires you? What is it that you do to relax, to give you ideas? What makes you what you are?
So I am a believer in what is in basketball is called the full court press. So that play the whole thing, So I don't have any silos in my head.
You're not center right, center left, center.
No, that's an ideological point. I'm saying silos in
basketball.
My head.
I was talking.
That's no. I play the whole thing. So you play forward, back continuously. Maybe people find it more exhausting, but in my head, there are no silos. There is no silo between history, geography, economics, urban design, or any other space in life, because these are actually pedagogical separations.
Yeah, because you talk about monuments also. So many times I've seen you've taken pictures in your book.
I've even published reports on what we should do with national monuments and so on. So in my head, there is no separation between these two. In fact, in real life, there isn't any separation between these two. And so I think the fact that these subjects are taught separately, that is just convenience of the academic system. The real world does not function in silos at all, and I don't see why we should in the real world have these silos. If you have the processing power to deal with different things and you find them interesting, do it.
But the perception about the right wing, if I mean, I'm using that term, I know nobody likes it, or the right and left, but the perception about the right wing is, they're not happy people. They don't know how to relax. They don't know. So they're very sanskari. They will eat only vegetarian food. They're not urbanists. You're an urbanist.
Absolutely.
Right? So the entire idea, that you are breaking that stereotypes.
Well, as far as vegetarian food is concerned, let me say that I am on record to say that I am a great lover of crustaceans,
Okay.
as is well known.
But that's again stereotype, no? Bengali, okay, fair.
Yeah, so people. So I think people have these stereotypes, and there's no particular reason to have them. I have also written books like Life Over Two Beers, and what do I relax?
Cricket?
Well,
Cricket.
No, not cricket. Not cricket.
Not cricket.
No, I cannot understand how people watch Test cricket. This is really like watching paint dry. If you want
don't
to
say that.
Absolutely. If you want to lounge around on the lawns for 5 days, choose croquet. Okay?
Oh God, the most boring thing ever.
Yeah, the same thing as Test cricket. If you want to make it interesting, get rid of the pads and the helmets. Maybe I'll watch it. Otherwise,
That's
please.
a blood sport you want to watch.
Yeah, so I like martial arts. I am a black belt in Taekwondo. I like watching mixed martial arts,
Okay.
boxing.
You trained in martial arts.
Yeah, I'm a black belt in Taekwondo.
Now that's something that your ancestors would love, right?
Yes.
Shooters, and then now you have.
Yeah, akhada runners. They used to run akhadas. So yes, absolutely. Both Lalinaksha Sanyal and Sachin Sanyal were very much, to run akhadas. So very much
much for Punjabis who think that Bengalis are more into art and culture and have nothing to do with martial arts and all. And here you are.
So it's a stereotype, right? So Bengalis, at least the stereotype Bengalis have of Punjabis, they're not into culture but agriculture. But that's not true. A Punjabi music and poetry has a very long and rich history.
Yeah.
So the same thing is true of Bengal. 100 years ago, interestingly, Bengalis were known for being entrepreneurs. Nobody thinks of that as being the case.
Yeah.
My own family, as I told you, my mother's family were entrepreneurs. So there is, there are,
and you travel a lot. I've seen in your book that you weren't just you didn't just go into a library and do your research. You went to all those places and you want to partake in the culture of the place. Like
absolutely,
you've gone and you've tasted cuisine. Somebody takes you to a restaurant in a place which you imbibe.
Yes. So it's not so much clear in this book, but my earlier books is even
also.
more so that I go to those places and I talk about what happened. But even here, I go to Raj Bihari Bose's restaurant in Tokyo and tasted his recipe, for example, of chicken curry. So my view here is that you need to be able to engage in it. Now, there is also a personal angle to this. I actually don't like writing. People don't realize this.
No, after so many books.
No, I actually dislike writing. I actually like researching them. Okay. I thoroughly enjoy researching all these books. You go to places, you do cool stuff. You know. So I enjoy that part of the thing.
But you humanize those people so much. It's not dry characters in your book.
Yes. And then
when you talk, like you said, about the curry.
Yes, so I go and eat because, by the way, Raj Bihari Bose earned his living running a restaurant. So and his chicken curry is still his recipe is still being used in Tokyo.
So people interest you, right? It's not just dry interest.
Yeah, people interest me, but I think what interests me is actually the act of researching all of this. Because I said I don't have too many silos in my head. So this is part of that. I like to immerse myself in the world in general. So this is part of that immersion process. So when I'm researching, it makes no sense going and spending all your time in the library. And by the way, if you just do that, you'd actually miss many, many important things. Like, for example, it may say in the memoirs, let's say, that I went in so-and-so place and went down this lane and turned left. Now, somebody who just read it in a book will not understand that turning left is important, because if you go there, you'll see that if you turn right, something totally different would have happened.
Yeah.
But there is no way you would be able to tell that if you just read it. So you have to go to that place, immerse yourself into it. And as I said, it's part of what I do anyway. As so I went to and some of it I enjoy myself doing.
Like the cellular jail thing,
Yes.
till you went and saw those rooms,
Yes.
that just to say that they were tortured wasn't
Yeah, you
enough.
can't tell. You have to
You
go there. These are tiny rooms, smaller than this room.
Yeah.
Cold brick walls, and with just a door, a barred door in front of you. Where, by the way, it's been designed in such a way that the prison guards can continuously watch you,
Hmm.
whereas you can't
Yeah.
talk to anybody on either side. So it has been designed for a particular kind of mental control,
Hmm.
and you can read all of you want about it,
Like
but if
Jallianwala Bagh,
Yes.
unless
go and
you
stand
go
there,
you don't. You feel suffocated when you go
not
there.
just that, you don't
Yes.
also realize that a few weeks later, Dyer was actually given a saropa in the Golden
Yes.
Temple. Now that is bad in itself, but when you go there, you realize that the Jallianwala Bagh and the Golden Temple are 300 meters apart.
Yeah.
You're literally going to the same location, and you are being honored for carrying out genocide. So I think it's very, very important to go to the place. Otherwise,
That is again a part which was the band-aid. I keep coming back to that. The collaborators and the band-aid. That
Yeah.
nobody talks about how he was given a saropa, about how there were collaborators then.
absolutely, they are collaborators then, and they are collaborators now. I
I'm
mean, if
coming back to the book, even though
yeah, but
I
you
was
can
done.
see that happening even in today.
Yeah.
So, for example, even this suspicious narrative that is continuously bandied about India, electoral autocracy and all of this.
Yeah.
Or, for example, the BBC program that was recently done, very
Yeah.
controversial one. What is interestingly that much of this is actually done by people of Indian ethnic origin.
Mm.
So this collaborator class is still there. Interestingly, many of these people are direct descendants of those collaborators. But point is that this class has always existed. And we can't deny that, few 100,000 Brits ran a country of hundreds of millions of people. It was only possible because of collaboration.
But today, there's no monetary benefit that they would get.
No,
by doing that.
well, first of all, there is monetary benefit. I mean, after all, you wouldn't need billionaires to be funding this stuff otherwise, would you? And then there are intelligence agencies of friendly countries, some of them in our neighborhood. There are corporate interests, and so on. So I think you have, the entire episode relating to vaccines, for example, just happened 3 years ago. Clearly driven by all kinds of corporate interests.
Yes. And it comes out later, and then you say that they weren't exactly Cassandras who were warning us about this. The other thing that which I wanted to ask you, which when we were talking about the book, was about when you had written about how Marxist literature was kept in those jails, and it was. Tell me about the influence of Marxism on the revolutionaries. I'm coming back to the book, though I was done with the book, but I'm going to come back to it. And the other thing was about the influence of Hinduism also, because many people think that the revolutionaries were atheists and agnostic.
Not at all.
Not at all. So
not at all. So
yeah.
first of all, a very large part of the revolutionary movement is directly derived from not just Hinduism, but a specific branch of it, the Shaktiism. Many of them were very strong Shaktas, i.e. worshippers of Bhavani or Durga or Kali and so on. Many of the initiations into the revolutionary movement happened with a text in Gita or Veda or something in one hand, a sword or a revolver in the other hand, and oath was taken to Durga or Bhavani or Kali. So Shaktiism is a very important part of this. When you listen to Vande Mataram, the first two stanzas are relatively secular about the motherland, but the next three are clearly derived from Shakta imagery. So
the part of Vande Mataram which not many people recite.
Yes, but you should listen to it.
Yeah.
In fact, for this book, I actually created for the third and fourth stanzas. I got my younger son to create a video for it. By the way,
Yeah.
you can see it online.
कीर्ति तुम्ही मर्मा त्वं प्राण शरीरे आहुते तुम्ही मा शक्ति हृदये तुम्ही मा भक्ति आहुते तुम्ही मा शक्ति हृदये तुम्ही मा भक्ति তোমার প্রতিমা করে মন্দিরে
What happens is that, it's important to remember this because this is the section that was sung by the revolutionaries to the gallows. And so Hinduism, and more specifically Shaktiism, was a very major part of the ideological driving force of all of this. And
That comes in that Anand Math movie
absolutely
also.
comes in Anand Math. And by the way, they are also being inspired by, for example, Shivaji, who himself is inspired by Bhavani. So there is this very strong lineage of ideas and so on. Now, somewhere in the 1920s, interest arises in Marxism, because remember, till the point of the Russian Revolution, nobody really has heard of Marxism in India. It's really in the late 20s that something pops up. But in the revolutionaries living outside India are the first to find out about it. Many of them, by the way, have become refugees in Soviet Union because they have nowhere to run away. So they end up in Tashkent, and one of them, M.N. Roy, actually founds the Communist Party of India in Tashkent in the early 1920s. But in India, nobody knows much about this till the very late 1920s. And one of the very first people to read about the Marxism in India is, of course, Bhagat Singh. But it is very important to remember that Bhagat Singh is not the founder of the communist movement in India. He's in fact himself a part of a explicitly nationalist movement. He's hanged, do remember, for avenging the death of Lala Lajpat Rai, who would today be called Hindu nationalist. His movement, the Hindustan Republican Association, and the revolutionary movement from which he derives himself, is led by somebody called Sachindranath Sanyal, who totally despises Marxism. And he writes that repeatedly in his book. So he's a completely anti-Marxist. So in his tract, which he wrote while in jail, called Why I'm an Atheist, Bhagat Singh himself says that, I am the only person in this system
left over
who is kind of believes in Marxism, and everybody else is a nationalist, and so on. So that is that is how things were till the 1930s. Now what happens is that the communist movement begins to gather pace in the 1930s. There are many reasons for this. Some of it is Russian support, but interestingly, also reason was that the British actually supported the spread of Marxist literature in Indian jails to the revolutionaries, in order to divide them from the nationalists. So many revolutionaries went into jail as nationalists and came out as Marxists. And of course, by the 1930s, who controls the Communist Party? It's British communists. And to some extent, the Russian communists. There's some conflict between the two. But British communists, double agents like Rajni Palme Dutt, who was half Indian, half Swedish, and many others. And of course, it turns out to be a great investment because, of course, the Marxist, former revolutionaries, now Marxists, communists, side with the British during the Second World War. And so you have the Communist Party leaders calling Netaji as, running dog of Tojo, and, criticizing him and so on. So that is how it happens. Now, what happens, unfortunately, is that M.N. Roy, the original founder of the CPI, drifts off from the party. And of course, after independence, there is another problem that, they had said all these bad things about people like Netaji, and they didn't really participate in the freedom struggle. So they adopt Bhagat Singh as a sort of, see, our guy had also participated in the freedom struggle. But in fact, Bhagat Singh had nothing to do with the Communist Party of India. So they are retrospectively bringing him back. And that is why you have this strange situation. 3 people are hanged on the same day for the same crime. Bhagat Singh, Sukhdev
Rajguru.
Thapar and Rajguru, you only hear about Bhagat Singh. Why? Because he has been resurrected by the Marxists. And because he's the only person they could sort of say, see, our Marxist guy also did something. And so he then becomes like a founding father of Marxist movement and also freedom fighter, and is adopted and built out in subsequent decades. Of course, Bhagat Singh is a remarkable person, but his subsequent...
Not an icon of Marxism is what you're saying.
Yeah, he's not quite an icon of Marxism. He was not a part of the Marxist movement. He was a part of a nationalist movement.
Yeah.
As I said, he ultimately gets hanged for avenging the death of a Hindu nationalist.
Yeah.
The other two who are hanged with him would today also be called Hindu nationalists. So, it's rather difficult.
We're going to go into a burrow now about Hindu nationalism, and that's a whole different thing.
Yes.
So anyway, for all of you, do read this. It's a very easy read, doesn't take much time, but very interestingly told story about so many heroes that we should have known about. Thank you, Sanjeev, for being part of this podcast.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you for watching or listening into this podcast. Do like or subscribe on whichever channel you have seen this or heard this. Namaste. Jai Hind. Click here to watch the previous episodes.
The weather turned absolutely bad. Unbelievable. What I saw the day previous to when I saw while I landed to what I was now seeing, sudden change. It turned blizzardous. How this particular thing came up was because Kal Bulkumar realized that the map that he was being shown had a straight line drawn from a point called NJ9842 joining the Karakoram Pass. It's not one man who does it. It's a team that does it. General Chibba was quite forthright. He said, look, the Chinese have occupied Aksai Chin because we were not at Aksai Chin then. And since it's our area, we must occupy it. Pakistanis were sponsoring expeditions through the Saltoro Ridgeline because between the Saltoro Ridgeline and the Karakoram Mountains is the Siachen Glacier. Ziaul Haq himself telling DG aisa hai, Punjab mein inko lagaye rakh tu, and Siachen will take. So Pakistan is not a country which can be trusted at all. Here to sustain 10 men on top of Bilafonla probably would have a tail which is of 40 to 50 men. When we were hoisting the national flag over there, just about reaching Bilafonla, I find a helicopter coming from the Pakistani direction. He saw that these Indians are already on top of Bilafonla. So he took a U-turn and went back.
Namaste, Jai Hind. Welcome to another edition of ANI Podcast with Smita Prakash. Joining me on this edition is my colleague Ajit Dubey, Editor, National Security. 13th April 2023 marks the 39th anniversary of Operation Meghdoot. It was the Indian Army operation to seize control of the Siachen Glacier, which was considered the highest battlefield in the world. In 1984, the Kumaon Regiment, one of the oldest infantry regiments of the Indian Army, and units from the Ladakh Scouts, nicknamed Snow Leopards, were tasked with the responsibility of digging into and controlling the critical peaks and passes of the glacier. Why was this significant? What role did it play in the India-Pakistan conflict? Did we learn lessons from the operation on the LOC, the line of control between India and Pakistan? And has it come into play when our forces deal with the ground situation at the line of actual control with China? To speak on Operation Meghdoot, I have with me Lieutenant General Sanjay Kulkarni, recipient of the Param Vishisht Seva Medal, Ati Vishisht Seva Medal, Shaurya Chakra Sena Medal, Vishisht Seva Medal. Thank you for coming on the podcast, General Kulkarni. It's an absolute honor to have you here. 39 years since Operation Meghdoot. You were a young officer then. So tell us what happened then.
Firstly, thank you very much